Welcome. You've just stepped into the empty boat. This is not a place of answers. It is a place of quiet questions, of stories that breathe like lanterns in the fog, of old wooden temples, moonlit tea, and the silence between two heartbeats. Here, we do not rush. We let each word fall like a leaf on still water. We let stories unfold, not to teach you, but to remind you of something you already carry inside, but may have forgotten. So, find a quiet corner. Loosen the knots inside your chest. Let the noise of the world drift far behind you. We are about to begin 25 stories, each one a mirror, a whisper, a candle in a dark room. They are not about monks or magic. They are about you, about grief, about letting go, about what remains. When everything else falls away, you are safe here. You are welcome here. You are already home. Let us begin. Story 1. The House with No Locks. The first time Min returned to his childhood home in the northern hills of Vietnam. It was not for nostalgia, but for silence. He had spent the last 20 years wrapped in tailored suits and digital security systems. As a senior banking director in Hanoi, Min measured life in terms of control, passwords, gates, alarms, double authentication. His success was built on managing risk, eliminating surprises, and locking down vulnerability. The city respected him. His house had no windows that opened, only central air and surveillance. No one could enter uninvited. Not even grief, but grief, as Min would learn, does not knock. It arrives inside a sealed envelope, a soft-spoken stranger, or a tattered notebook left behind by someone you no longer remember how to love. The envelope came on a Wednesday, hand-delivered by an elderly monk who walked past the glass doors of Min's office with bare feet and an expression both empty and full. "Your brother left this for you," the monk said, bowing. "He lived at Lin An for 6 years. We found him by the river. He was at peace." Min did not speak. The monk did not stay. The notebook was cloth-bound, pages slightly damp from humidity. Inside, in Kai's distinct handwriting, were stories, not of apologies or regrets, but parables. Zen tales, both ancient and strange. One about a bird who refused to migrate. One about a well that ran dry only after it was covered with gold. And between the stories, Kai's own reflections. One line kept appearing again and again. "When I stopped locking things, I found peace." Min closed the book and stared at the skyline from his 18th floor office, unable to breathe. That night, he left Hanoi. The journey took 8 hours by bus and 2 hours on foot. He arrived in the mist village just before sunrise, dragging a small suitcase behind him like a broken promise. The house was still standing, wooden walls eaten by termites, roof chipped and uneven. The door, as it always had been, hung loosely on its hinges. There were no locks, no fences, no cameras, just earth, wind, and memories he had spent decades burying beneath layers of ambition. The house felt like a secret waiting to be remembered. Min stepped inside. The smell of damp wood and old incense hit him like an embrace from a mother long gone. He placed his suitcase down and stood in the middle of the room, staring at the dusty altar where their father once burned offerings. Kai had lived here, alone, quietly, without locks, without visitors. Min didn't cry. Not yet. He slept on the floor that night, beside a broken lamp and a cracked teacup. And when he woke, the village was breathing around him the sounds of roosters, distant laughter from the morning market, wind moving through bamboo. He walked to the nearby Lin-an temple. The temple sat on a gentle slope overlooking rice fields, surrounded by stone lanterns and bougainvillea vines. A bell hung from an ancient Bodhi tree, its clapper swaying in the wind like a heartbeat. The monk from the city was there, sweeping leaves. "You came," he said, as if Min had always been. "Meant to? Why did he come here?" Min asked. The monk looked up, his eyes like still water, because this was the only place that didn't ask him to be more than he already was. They sat on the stone steps for a long time. Min asked little, the monk offered less. But in that silence, a kind of listening emerged. Over the next days, Min remained in the village. He read more of Kai's notebook. Each story peeled away a layer of his old life. One tale was about a man who built walls so high he could no longer see the sky. Another about a boat that floated in circles until its sailor learned to throw away his map in the margins. Kai had written questions. Why do we only protect what we fear to lose? Can you love someone without needing to keep them? Is safety the absence of danger or the absence of needing control? Min didn't have answers, but he had never felt more exposed. He visited the temple each morning, then returned to the house in the evening, cleaning it slowly room by room. He found a shirt of Kai's, neatly folded, a tin box with dried jasmine petals, a pair of sandals too worn to wear. Nothing was locked, nothing hidden. There was freedom in that. One afternoon, Min sat beneath the Bodhi tree with the monk. He asked, why did Kai write so much about locks? The monk poured tea into two mismatched cups and said, because he used to lock himself away too, not with steel, but with shame. Min looked at the leaves trembling above them. He left the bank after the inheritance fight. Min said, voice low. He said he didn't want any of it. I told him he was a coward, that he had no ambition. And did you believe that? The monk asked. Min nodded. For a long time, yes, and now, Min's hands tightened around the warm cup. I don't know anymore. The monk took a slow sip. Your brother didn't reject wealth. He rejected walls. He wanted to live where he could open a door and not fear what would come in. Min stayed silent. The monk continued, locks are made of fear. We use them not only on our houses, but our hearts. We build careers, reputations, passwords, but who are we trying to keep out? Min blinked against the afternoon sun. Everyone, he whispered, and maybe myself. That night, Min returned to the house and opened every window. He placed Kai's notebook on the altar beside a lit candle. He sat cross-legged, facing the door that never closed properly. He watched the light flicker. He watched the darkness breathe. For the first time in years, he let himself think of their childhood. Playing with paper boats in the flooded alley. Kai falling and scraping his knee. Min yelling at him for being clumsy. The way Kai cried, silently, never asking for help. He remembered the day of the funeral, their father lying still, the incense curling like regret, the silence between them already turning into distance. He never said sorry. He never said goodbye. Min closed his eyes and whispered, forgive me. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. In the weeks that followed, Min didn't return to Hanoi. He stayed. He swept the house each morning, lit incense each evening. He began writing in the back of Kai's notebook his own reflections. Not as a banker, not as a man of success, but as a brother learning to live without walls. One day, he wrote, I locked the doors because I feared losing what was inside. But now I understand what's real can't be stolen. And what's stolen was never truly mine. On the 49th day after Kai's passing, Min walked to the temple carrying a small box of his brother's belongings. The monk met him by the lotus pond. "I'm leaving soon," Min said, "but not back to the city. I think I want to stay somewhere simpler." The monk nodded. Min hesitated. "Will I ever feel whole again?" The monk smiled. "You were never broken, only covered." They buried the box beneath the Bodhi tree. No plaque, no name. Just petals and silence. Before he left, Min placed a note in the house. On the old wooden door, he nailed it softly with a single rusted pin. It read, "This house has no locks. You are welcome here. Please remove your shoes and your masks." As he walked down the hill for the last time, the wind lifted, and for a brief moment, Min thought he heard Kai's laughter, soft, distant, but unmistakably free. That night, far away in another town, a candle flickered in a stranger's room, and a man who had once lived behind walls slept with his windows open and his heart unlocked. Story 2. The widow's kettle. The market in Barlam village opened before the sun. In the fragile blue hour, when shadows still clung to rooftops and the earth smelled of last night's rain, in one corner, near the shrine of the land spirit, a small copper kettle hissed over a makeshift stove. The sound was faint, like an old woman's breath when she has cried too long. The kettle belonged to Mdian, a widow in her early 60s whose face bore the expression of someone who had not yet finished weeping, even when she was silent. Every morning she arrived before the vendors and left after the last straw basket had been swept away. She sold tea, bitter and dark, brewed with a handful of dried ginger and the smallest pinch of rock sugar, not enough to sweeten the taste, but just enough to keep the bitterness company. She never spoke unless spoken to, and when she did, her voice seemed to come from somewhere else, far behind her eyes. Children whispered rumors about her, that she had buried a son, that she had once cursed the sky, that she never smiled, not even during tit. But none of them truly knew her story, because MDN didn't tell stories. She carried them. The truth, like most grief, began long before anyone noticed it. Her son, Li, had been a bright boy. Not the kind that draws attention, but the kind that brings warmth to a room simply by sitting in it. He had the softest voice, loved to sketch birds in the margins of his notebooks, and always brewed tea for his mother after school. Then the fever came. For days. No warning, no cure. And on the 5th morning, he stopped breathing. There had been no hospital within reach, no medicine but faith. And faith, that winter, had not been enough. After the funeral, MDN packed away his drawings, his school bag, even the small wooden chair he liked to sit on. She left the altar bare, save for a single stick of incense each morning. She sold the family rice field and bought the kettle. "If I cannot raise my son," she whispered, "let me warm strangers." That was 15 years ago. One morning, as the fog still curled between the banana trees, a young man arrived at her tea corner. He wore simple robes and sandals, his head freshly shaven. A novice monk, no older than her son would have been. He bowed gently before sitting. "May I?" he asked, pointing to the stool. She nodded and poured tea. They sat in silence, steam rising between them like a veil. After a while, the monk looked into his cup and said, "You pour tea like someone who remembers how it feels to be cold." Mdian looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. And you speak like someone who hasn't lost anything yet. The monk smiled, but did not answer. For the next 7 mornings, he returned. Always alone, always quiet. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. Once, he told her about his temple, nestled between 2 ridges beyond the pine forest. Another time, he offered her a folded lotus made of palm leaves. She accepted it without a word and placed it beside the kettle on the 8th morning. He didn't come, nor on the 9th. On the 10th, MDN began boiling water before the sun had risen, as if expecting someone she wasn't willing to name. She waited. The tea grew cold. That evening, as she packed up, the monk returned, but something in him had changed. His face was pale, his movements heavy. He sat without bowing and stared into the distance. "Is someone sick?" MDN asked. He didn't answer at first. Then, softly, "My mother passed away 2 nights ago." MDN placed a fresh cup before him and sat. The kettle hissed again. Neither of them reached for the tea. "She wanted to see me in robes before she died," he said. "I didn't make it in time." MDN closed her eyes. The silence grew thick. "I told myself I had let go," he said, "that I understood impermanence. But when I stood by her body, I felt like a boy again. Lost, angry, empty." The tea cooled between them. MDN looked at the monk, her voice low. "Grief doesn't respect enlightenment. It doesn't care what we've studied. It arrives, it burns, and it stays until it's ready to leave." He looked at her, and for the first time saw the well behind her eyes. "Does it ever leave?" he asked. MDN reached for the kettle, poured the tea again, this time into both cups. "Not entirely," she said, "but it changes, becomes quieter. Like a song you don't play anymore, but still hum when no one's listening." They drank in silence. That night, MDN lit incense on her altar. For the first time in years, she placed beside it a bowl of rice and a sketchbook, her son's old one. She opened it, ran her fingers over the drawings, a sparrow, a dragonfly, a boy with a kettle. She began to cry, not the shaking kind, but the kind that soaks you from within, like rain seeping through old wood. The next morning, she brought the sketchbook with her to the market. When the monk returned, she handed it to him. "He used to draw birds," she said, "before the fever." The monk took the book with both hands. He did not open it. "Not yet," he bowed. "I will keep it," he said, "until you ask for it back." Weeks passed. The monk continued to visit. Some days he brought flowers, other days silence. One morning he brought a question. "There is a woman in my temple," he said. "She lost her daughter in a car accident. She won't eat, won't speak. Would you come?" MDN looked away. "I am no healer, you are." To me, that afternoon, for the first time in 15 years, she left the market before noon. She packed the kettle, the cups, and the old charcoal stove. She walked with the monk through the pine forest, past rice fields and narrow bridges, until the path widened and the temple appeared. Quiet as breath, the woman was sitting beneath a Bodhi tree, her hair unbrushed, her eyes blank. MDN placed the kettle beside her, sat down, said nothing. She poured the tea. The woman did not drink. MDN poured again, on the 3rd cup. The woman lifted it to her lips. MDN said, "My son died too. His name was Li Ai. He liked ginger tea and drawing birds. For a long time, I thought, the world had ended. But the world doesn't end when someone dies. Only a part of you does. The rest waits for you to return. The woman began to cry. Mdian did not comfort her. She let her cry. She simply poured more tea. That night, the moon rose behind the Bodhi tree, pale and full. The three women sat beneath it, one with sorrow fresh, one with sorrow aged, and one with sorrow transformed. When Mdian returned to the village, she didn't reopen her tea stall. Instead, she began walking from village to village, carrying the kettle, the cups, the stories. She never charged for tea, never introduced herself. She simply sat, poured, and listened. Some called her mad. Others called her a wandering nun. But those who drank her tea said it always tasted the same. Bitter, warm, and just sweet enough to remind you that bitterness, too, can be held gently. Years later, when men's name faded into the hush of time, a traveler arrived in Barlam looking for her. The market was different now, paved louder, but in the corner near the old shrine, a copper kettle remained, blackened with age, sitting quietly on a stone pedestal. Beside it, a plaque read, "She poured without asking, she listened without judging, she healed without claiming." The traveler sat beside the kettle. A stranger passed by and handed her a cup of tea. It tasted like memory and rain and the silence left behind when a mother learns to breathe again. Story 3. Beneath the bamboo bridge. The bamboo bridge in LCCSN village was old, too old to still be standing. It creaked like the bones of a man who had carried too much and slept too little. Locals said the bridge should have collapsed years ago, and yet it didn't. Some said it held together not by nails, but by memory. It stretched across a narrow stream, no more than 10 meters from end to end, with green moss curling up its legs like secrets that refused to stay buried. Beneath it, the water was shallow but clear, and on moonlit nights, the reflection of the bridge shimmered like a ghost reaching up from another world. Most people passed it without thinking. For them, it was just a shortcut from the rice paddies to the market, but for Tanji, it was the edge of a decision he had carried for years. He stood on the bridge one evening, just after the sun dipped behind the hills, and looked down. The water below barely moved. It was quiet, inviting in a strange way, neither hostile nor kind. Tanji tightened his grip on the wooden railing. He had come here to end something. Perhaps not his life, not yet, but the weight of it. The ache that bloomed each morning like a bruise beneath his ribs. The silence that screamed when he turned off his phone. The shame that slept in his stomach like a stone. He didn't know how long he had been standing there when he heard footsteps behind him. "You'll catch a cold if you stay too long," a voice said gently. Tanji turned. A man stood a few meters away, barefoot, dressed in simple grey robes, with a shaved head and a bundle of firewood slung across his back. "I wasn't planning to stay," Tongue muttered. The man smiled faintly. "But you weren't planning to go either." Tanji said nothing. The man walked forward and placed the firewood down by the side of the bridge. Then, without asking, he sat down right in the middle, legs dangling over the edge, looking at the water below. Tanji hesitated, then sat beside him. The man didn't look at him, only at the stream. "This bridge is older than both of us," he said. "It used to shake more. I was terrified of it as a boy. I thought it would swallow me." T gave a dry laugh. "Seems solid enough now." "Funny thing," the man continued. "My teacher used to say, bridges don't collapse under footsteps. They collapse under indecision. I never understood what he meant until I was older. They sat for a while in silence. Crickets began their evening song. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then stopped. "What brings you here?" the monk asked, not looking at him. Tanji looked down. "Nothing worth telling." "Then tell me something not worth telling," the monk said. Tanji laughed, the sound brittle. "I failed, that's all. I failed at everything. My father wanted me to take over the family shop, but I couldn't. I went to the city, tried to study medicine, but dropped out. Got into debt, lied to people, hurt someone I loved. Came back here because there was nowhere left to go." The monk nodded slowly. And now I just stand here, thinking, maybe it would have been better if I hadn't come back at all." The monk leaned back on his palms. "You think the bridge judges those who walk on it?" Tia turned to him, confused. "It doesn't care if you're a thief, a monk, or a broken man," the monk continued. "It carries you anyway. It has no pride, no shame, just presence. It bends, yes, it creaks, but it doesn't ask questions." Tongue stared at him. The monk looked back. "Maybe you are like the bridge, still standing, still carrying." Tanji shook his head. "I don't feel like I'm standing." "That's the part you don't have to feel. It just is." Tanji looked away, eyes burning. "I ruined someone's life," he said. "I lied to a woman who loved me. I promised her a future. I used her money. Then I vanished. I couldn't face her. I still can't." The monk took a deep breath. "Have you tried apologizing?" "I don't deserve to." "Deserve," the monk said, "is a strange concept. Do trees deserve to bloom? Does the moon deserve to shine? Or do they simply do so because that's what they were made for?" Tanji didn't reply. The monk leaned forward, picked up a smooth stone from beneath the bridge, and placed it on the railing between them. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "There was once a boy who lived beside a river. One day he threw a stone into the water and watched the ripples spread. The next day he did it again and again. Each time he felt a little lighter. Years passed. Then one day he returned to the river and found it dry. Only the stones remained. The boy cried. He had thought the river would always wash his guilt away, but now it was gone." Tanji listened, not blinking. The boy sat in the dry bed for hours. Then an old woman came and gave him a single seed. She said, "Plant this where your stone once fell." He did. And in time, a tree grew. It didn't wash his guilt, but it gave shade. And birds came. And one day, a girl sat beneath it and forgave him. The monk looked at him. "Some people throw stones forever. Others plant something." Tanji lowered his head. The stream below reflected the faint moonlight now, rippling softly. "I don't know if I can fix anything," Tanji whispered. "Maybe not," said the monk. "But you can sit with it. You can speak with it. You can let it change you." Tanji nodded, barely. "Come to the temple tomorrow," the monk said as he stood. "Bring nothing, leave nothing." He picked up the firewood and began walking down the path. Tanji sat for a long time after that, long after the crickets quieted and the moon rose fully. He didn't jump, he didn't run, he just stayed. The next morning he went to the temple. He stayed for a week, then a month, then a year. He cleaned floors, chopped vegetables, helped mend robes. He didn't speak much, but when he did, he asked questions about pain, about truth, about how to carry shame without becoming it. One evening, a woman arrived at the temple. seeking shelter. Tanji recognized her immediately, the woman he had hurt. She didn't recognize him at first. He had changed. But when she did, she froze. "I can leave," he said, but she shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I came to let something go." They sat beneath a lantern for hours. She spoke. He listened. Then he spoke and cried. She didn't say she forgave him. She didn't need to. When she left, she placed a small flower on the windowsill of his room, a sign, a beginning, years. Later, Tanji became the keeper of the temple's garden. He planted bamboo near the bridge. Each spring, the shoots rose like promises, and when someone came to the bridge carrying more than they could hold, he would walk beside them and say, "This bridge doesn't collapse beneath your weight, only beneath your fear of moving forward." And then he'd sit, wait, and when they were ready, walk with them across, not to forget, but to begin again. Story 4. The monk who was a murderer. Was the season of dry winds when the stranger arrived. Dust clung to the soles of sandals and leaves no longer rustled. They scraped, like whispers that had forgotten softness. The village of Inkstone had long been quiet, nestled between hills that watched the years pass with indifference. People lived simply, spoke rarely, and trusted only what they could touch. So when a monk appeared at the edge of the village, wrapped in faded grey robes and silence, no one quite knew what to make of him. He carried no alms bowl, no staff, no papers, only a bundle of old books and a scar on his right hand that caught the light like a forgotten memory. He bowed to each person he passed, eyes lowered, and made his way toward the dilapidated shrine by the edge of the rice fields, a place the villagers had not used in years. By dusk, he had swept the shrine, repaired the steps, and lit 3 sticks of sandalwood incense. By morning, he had settled in. The villagers watched. Children were told not to disturb him. Shopkeepers glanced at him with the wary curiosity one reserves for snakes and saints alike. But he asked for nothing, spoke only when spoken to, and every morning he bowed toward the east and sat in stillness until the birds forgot he was human. They began calling him Thyan. He became part of the background, like the hills or the sun. Weeks passed, then months. One by one, people began to visit him, not for blessings or miracles, but for silence. A man who had lost his father came and sat without speaking. A woman whose daughter no longer visited brought tea. A teenager who had tried to run away simply leaned against the wall, listening to the wind as the monk sat beside him. He never gave advice, never corrected, never judged. He only listened, and slowly the shrine returned to life. Moss was swept away, candles stayed lit. The air felt lighter. Then one morning, a man arrived in the village. He was not from Inkstone. His shirt was tucked too tightly, his shoes too clean, and his eyes scanned like they were searching for something buried. He carried a photo, crumpled at the edges. The photo showed a younger version of Thyan. No robe, no shaved head, no smile, just a face wanted by the law. His name had once been Home. He had been a schoolteacher in the city, beloved by many, until the night when he killed a man. The man had been drunk, violent, threatening Hong's younger sister. Something had snapped. A blade, a scream, blood dot, and then silence. He had fled, vanished, left behind a warrant and a family too stunned to speak his name aloud. For 7 years, no one knew where he had gone, until now. The man with the photo found the shrine easily. It was the only place in the village that looked truly cared for. Thigh Ann was sweeping the courtyard. The man stood before him and said the name Hone. The monk looked up. There was no fear in his face, only a pause, as if that name would a shirt he had once worn but no longer fit. I am him, the monk said. The man lowered the photo. You don't deny it, no. Do you know why I'm here? I think so. The man sat on the stone steps, the same ones the villagers had come to know as their quiet confessionals. My brother, he said, wasn't a good man. But he was my brother. I know, the monk replied. They sat in silence. I came here to see what kind of man you are now, the visitor said. I imagined someone hiding. But you're not hiding, are you? I was, the monk said. For many years, not from people, from myself. The man looked at him. And what changed? The monk gestured to the altar inside the shrine. I began to listen, to the part of me I had tried to kill. That night, the news spread through the village like fire wrapped in silk, quiet but impossible to ignore. Some wanted him gone. Others defended him. He killed a man, they whispered. But he saved my son, someone else said. He lied. He's the only one who sits with my mother now that her mind is gone. The village held a meeting. Jayan did not attend. When asked later why he didn't defend himself, he said, my words no longer carry the weight my silence can hold. The following morning, he began sweeping the shrine again, as usual. An old woman approached and placed a bowl of rice on the steps. My husband used to beat me, she said. No one believed me, not even my children. You may be a killer, but at least you don't lie. She walked away. A boy came and sat beside. The monk, saying nothing. Then a young girl brought incense. The villagers never reached a consensus. But no one removed him. The man with the photo stayed 3 more days. He watched the way Thyan listened to people, the way he never interrupted, the way he smiled not out of joy, but understanding. On the last day, he approached the monk once. More, do you want me to turn you in? He asked. No, the monk said, but I will go if that's what must be done. The man looked at him for a long time, then said, You're already serving a sentence. He left without taking the photo. Years passed. Thyan remained at the shrine. One day, the boy who had once sat beside him returned as a grown man. His voice was firm but kind. Why didn't you defend yourself? He asked. People would have understood. You could have told them why. The monk replied, because sometimes truth doesn't need to be spoken. It needs to be lived. The young man asked, and do you still carry the guilt? Thyan placed a leaf into a bowl of water and watched it float. It no longer carries me, he said, but I carry it gently, and that was all. No redemption sermon, no forgiveness asked. Only a man sitting in the place where the past had bled, where it still bled, but no longer poisoned. At night, the wind moved through the shrine, rustling the pages of old sutras, and in that space between who we were and who we choose to be, a monk swept leaves, a murderer, a healer, a man who did not run anymore. Story 5. The Inkstone and the Thorn, the far mountains of a quiet valley, lived an old calligrapher named Shejin. His hut was small, made of cedar and stone, nestled beneath a towering cypress that dropped needles like falling time. He had once been known in the city for his brilliant brushwork. Pieces hung in temples and palaces, his signature revered by nobles and monks alike. But after his wife passed away, Shejin disappeared from public life, leaving only silence and ink behind. Each day, he sat before an open window, grinding ink on a stone that had once belonged to his teacher. The inkstone was old, cracked at the corners, stained with decades of meditative practice. Shejin's strokes were no longer for fame or fortune. He wrote verses only the wind would read, characters fading into the seasons, into mist, into nothing. But one spring morning, just as the plum blossoms began to open, there came a knock at his door. It was rare for anyone to find their way to his hut. When he opened it, he found a boy, no older than 12, clutching a scroll and a thin satchel. "I walked from the village below," the boy said without introduction. "They say you can write prayers that speak to the gods." Shejin raised an eyebrow. "I only write what needs to be written," he said. "And often, even that is too much." The boy bowed deeply. "Please," he said. "My mother is dying. I want to give her a verse of peace, something that will let her go." There was something in the boy's eyes, something not childish, not frightened, but terribly clear. Shejin nodded and stepped aside. The boy entered and sat on the tatami, watching as the old man prepared his tools. Shejin poured a little water into the inkstone, began to grind the inkstick in slow circles, the way his master had taught him long ago. The boy sat in silence, waiting. "What is your mother's name?" Shejin asked. "Reika." "And what is the last thing you remember her smiling at?" The boy thought. A sparrow that landed on her finger. It was years ago, but she always remembered it. Shejin nodded again. He picked up his brush, dipped it, and began. The characters flowed in a single breath, his hand as steady as a still. Ponti did not think of words, only of silence. When it was done, he handed the scroll to the boy without reading it aloud. "She may not understand the words," Shejin said, "but if her heart is open, she will recognize the space between them." The boy bowed again and left. The old man did not expect to see him again. But a month passed, and one morning there was another knock. The same boy stood at the door, holding the scroll, not the one Shejin had written, but another, his own. He unrolled it and placed it on the floor between them. "I want to learn," the boy said simply. Shejin studied the characters. They were crude, unsure, leaning to far left or right. But there was something raw in them, a searching, like a seed cracking open. "You understand that this path leads nowhere," Shejin said. "You will gain nothing but yourself, and even that may vanish." The boy nodded, double quotes very well, said, "Shejin tomorrow, before the sun rises." Thus began their practice. Each day before dawn, they sat before the ink. Shejin taught him how to grind with the breath, how to let go of the idea of perfection, how the space between characters was as vital as the strokes themselves. The boy, whose name was Kato, learned to wait, to observe, to listen to the way. Ink moved on paper as if it were alive. Years passed. Kato grew, not just in skill, but in presence. He no longer asked questions. His brushstrokes began to echo Shejin, still imperfect, but resonant, quiet, inevitable. But one winter, Shejin fell ill. His breaths became ragged, his eyes clouded. Kato, now a young man, tended to him without complaint. He ground the ink each morning, kept the room warm, cooked soft rice and steeped bitter medicine. But one evening, Shejin beckoned him close. "There is one final task," the old man whispered. "There is a thorn in my chest. It has been there since my wife died. I never removed it. I simply painted round it. You must take it out. Kato looked at him, unsure. How do I remove something I cannot see? You must write the verse. I could never write, Shejin said, the one that speaks not to the gods, but to the thorn itself. He closed his eyes, and sleep claimed him. That night, Kato sat alone with the Inkstone. He lit a single candle. He did not write immediately. He listened. He thought of the stories Shejin never told, of the quiet grief in his eyes each time he looked at the mountains, of the way he kept a small hairpin beside his futon, never touched. And then, with no thought, no force, he dipped the brush and began to write. The verse flowed like wind through empty reeds. It did not name sorrow. It did not plead. It only acknowledged. When he finished, he placed the scroll beside his master's futon. By morning, Shejin had passed, but his face was still, as if the thorn had finally dissolved. Years later, Kato remained in the hut. He never descended to the village, but pilgrims began to visit, drawn by rumor. They asked for verses, blessings, fortunes. He would ask them the same questions Shejin had once asked him. What was the last thing your mother smiled at? What is the name you no longer say aloud? What space are you still afraid to sit with? He would write them, verses some short, some long, some so spare they seemed unfinished. But always, something shifted. One day, an old man arrived, bitter and stooped, with shaking hands. I've ruined everything, the man said. My children won't speak to me. My wife left 20 years ago. I have no name worth signing. Kato listened. The man took out an old inkstone, cracked and worn. This was my father's, he said. He died holding it. Kato turned it in his hands, gently. You want a verse? He asked. No, the man said. I want forgiveness. Kato nodded. He placed the inkstone before the man, poured water, and handed him the brush. Then write the name, Kato, said, and let the silence do the rest. The man stared at the brush, then at the paper. He began to write. Outside, the cypress swayed, and a single needle fell unnoticed. Story 6. The window between us. It began on a narrow alleyway, carved between two crumbling apartment blocks on the outskirts of a city that no longer remembered itself. Here, the scent of fried garlic mixed with car exhaust and plastic chairs, outnumbered trees. Children played football with plastic bottles. Old men stared into cracked teacups. And silence, when it came only after midnight, like an old dog circling before rest. Lin lived on the 5th floor of Building B, a room no larger than a shipping container. A faded calendar hung beside her door, still stuck on a month 3 years past. Her window, the only one, faced another window 10 feet across a narrow shaft belonging to Mr. Hung, a retired literature teacher who had grown as brittle as the spines of the books he once taught. They had never spoken. Each morning they would rise, open their curtains, and nod an unspoken truce held together by thin glass and mutual solitude. He would water his potted bonsai, hands trembling but precise. She would stretch in silence, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and memories that refused to age. She was in her early 30s, a former office worker turned caregiver for her bedridden father. Her mother had died when she was 15. Her brother had vanished into a gambling debt 3 years ago, taking with him what little hope her father had left. Since then, Lin had folded her life like a note left unread one corner at a time, until all that remained was duty. The window became her clock. If Mr. Hung's curtains opened late, She knew it was Sunday. If they remained closed too long, she worried. Once, when he didn't appear for 2 days, she sent a child downstairs with a knock. It turned out he had simply fallen asleep with a fever. When he returned, he gave a small bow of apology. She offered a brief smile. The world beyond the window was always too loud, too crowded, but the window between them, silent, framed for something else, a stillness, fragile and strange, something that could neither be named nor admitted. One day it cracked. It started with a shouting match. In the alley below, a man, red-faced and swaying, was hurling accusations at a younger woman who refused to meet his gaze. The usual noise, cursing, gossip, plastic doors slamming. But then a slap, then silence. Lin, frozen in her window, saw it. So did Mr. Hung. That night, Lin didn't sleep. The next morning, Hung opened his window, but Lin did not. The curtain remained drawn. When it finally parted that evening, she looked thinner, paler, her eyes red-rimmed. From his window, Mr. Hung held up a small slip of paper, pressed it gently to the glass. On it, written in a shaking hand, "Are you all right?" Lin stared at it for a moment, then nodded slowly. She closed the curtain again. The next day, a different note. "You don't have to be alone in this life." She didn't respond, but her curtain stayed open the next morning. A week passed, then another. Notes became a ritual. One each morning, one each evening. Nothing dramatic. He wrote about his cat, who had died 10 years ago. She wrote about the orchid her mother once raised. He asked if she remembered the old bookstore on Hoe Street. She did. The notes were never spoken aloud. Each remained pressed behind the glass, read through silence and reflection. A dialogue of ink and distance, until one morning she didn't appear again. By noon, the curtains were still closed. Mr. Hung waited. By dusk, he scribbled one last note. "If you need help, I will come." There was no answer. That night, rain began to fall, slow, persistent, as if trying to carve its way into the apartment walls. It wasn't until the next afternoon that Lin's curtain opened. But it wasn't Lin. It was a man in uniform. Behind him, others moved about the small apartment. Mr. Hung's heart thudded painfully in his chest. She had tried to take her own life. She had failed. The neighbor on the 3rd floor had smelled gas and called the fire department. Lin was found unconscious but alive. Her father had passed away in the night, silently, his hand still curled beneath the blanket as though gripping a ghost. She was taken to a clinic on the edge of the city. There, behind white walls and antiseptic smiles, she refused to speak. 2 weeks passed. The window remained empty. Mr. Hung sat each day before it, alone. He stopped writing notes. He stopped watering his bonsai. The silence returned, not peaceful, but sharp. Like the pause before something shatters. Then, on the 15th morning, a new note appeared. It was not in her handwriting. It was printed. "Visitor, Hung, tea, approved at 2 p.m. today." He put on his best shirt, the one with the stiff collar he wore when his wife was buried. He took the bus, hands clutched like prayers. The receptionist led him to a courtyard, where Lin sat in a wheelchair beneath a tree that had lost most of its leaves. They said nothing for 5 minutes. Then he handed her a note. "The world does not need to be kind for you to live in it." She didn't look at it right away. Instead, she watched a bird hopping along the stone path. When she did read it, something in her face cracked, not sadness, not gratitude, but recognition. A moment of being seen. She said the first words they had ever shared aloud. "Thank you." After that, he came every Saturday. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they just sat. He would bring her tea. She would bring him drawings. She had begun to sketch again quiet lines of rooftops and windows, and always to people, each facing the other through glass dot. In time, she was discharged, but she didn't return to the old apartment. The window between them no longer existed, but the bond had moved past pains and distance. Instead, Lynn took a small studio on the edge of the park. She found work in a community garden, helping elderly residents tend to forgotten soil. She brought Mr. Hung a bag of lychee every 2 weeks, and he, now aged 81, would tell her stories about his wife, how she once set his manuscript on fire. Mistaking it for trash, Lynn laughed for the first time in years. They never spoke of the night with the gas, or the father who died silently, or the brother who never came back. But every now and then, Lynn would place a blank slip of paper in the window of her studio, just for a moment, a ritual of remembrance, not for sadness but for distance bridged. And, in his room, Mr. Hung would fold his note into a small paper crane and let it rest on his bonsai. Neither forgot the window, but they no longer needed it. Story 7. The one who carried the mountain in, a forgotten village pressed between high ridges and whispering bamboo groves. There lived a man named Renjiro, who was known to all as the stone carrier. His back was curved like a half moon, his arms thick like twisted roots, and his gait slow, deliberate, always steady, never rushed each morning. Before the roosters crowed, Renjiro walked to the base of the northern hill, where a single boulder struck black and worn by time. For him, he would tie his sash around it, lift it onto his back, and carry it along a winding path up the mountain. He never spoke of why. He never failed to return, every day. For 27 years, children would watch him from behind cypress trunks, whispering legends of his past. Some said he once killed a man in anger. Others claimed the stone held the soul of his dead son. But none knew for certain. Only that rain or snow, sun or sickness, Renjiro always carried the same stone up the same path, only to carry it back down by dusk. One day, a young monk named Kazuo, newly ordained from the southern temple, came upon the village while on pilgrimage. His robes were pristine, his eyes eager with fresh purpose. Hearing tales of the stone carrier, Kazuo was immediately drawn not by curiosity, but by a certain disquiet in his heart. He sought out Renjiro at sunrise, meeting him at the mountain's foot. The old man looked at him without surprise. "You come to watch," Renjiro said. "I come to understand," the monk replied, bowing. "Why do you carry the stone?" Renjiro turned to the boulder, tied the sash, and without another word, lifted it onto his back. The young monk followed. As they ascended, the air grew thin, mist curling through the trees like unspoken thoughts. Birds called and were answered, only by silence. Renjiro walked without speaking, his breath deep and slow. Kazuo walked beside him, his sandals slipping on damp moss, robes catching on thorn. Finally, nearing the ridge, they paused. The boulder sat heavy on Renjiro's back, yet his eyes seemed far away, searching something beyond the horizon. "Still want to understand?" Renjiro asked, voice gravelly. Kazuo nodded. "Then carry it down." Renjiro untied the stone and set it gently. On the ground, with a slight bow, he stepped aside. Kazuo hesitated, but then, with shaking arms and eager resolve, tied the sash around his waist. The stone was heavier than it looked, oppressive, dead, resisting every movement. It pressed into his spine, his knees buckled. Each step down was agony. The path he had admired on the way up now mocked him. Every root snagged his foot. Every rock jabbed at his toes. His breath came in gasps. Halfway down, he fell, scraping his palm on jagged stone. Blood mixed with mud. When he finally reached the bottom, Kazuo collapsed beside the boulder. Arrived a moment later, calm, unhurried, and sat beside him. "Do you understand now?" Renjiro asked. Kazuo panted, chest rising and falling. "It's heavy, too heavy. I don't understand how you do it. Why you do it." Renjiro stared at the stone. "I carry this because I once killed a man." Kazuo turned sharply. It was long ago, in anger. "My brother, during a foolish argument. I struck him with a tool meant for stonework, not for flesh. He died that night. I buried him near this mountain." The old man continued, his voice even. "No prison took me. No judgment came. But inside, ... I built one. The guilt, the shame, they would not go. So I came to the mountain. I found this stone near where he lay. I lifted it. I said, if I can carry this weight every day, maybe I can carry the weight inside." Kazuo was silent. The village tales had been half-truths at best. "Does it help?" the monk asked quietly. Renjiro tilted his head. "At first, no. It broke my body. Not my sorrow, but over time, the stone became something else. A ritual, a mirror. I saw that what I carried was not just punishment, but intention. Each step was my way of bowing to the life I took, not to erase the past, to honor it." Kazuo looked at the stone again. It no longer seemed just an object. It had shape, yes, but it had history, burden, will. "But couldn't you just forgive yourself?" the monk asked. Renjiro smiled faintly, the first expression he had shown. "Forgiveness is not a switch to flip. It's a mountain to climb again and again. This was my way. It may not be yours." They sat in silence as the wind rustled. The bamboo birds resumed their calls. The village bells rang in the distance. Kazuo stood. His legs trembled, but his eyes were steady. "Thank you for the teaching," he said, bowing low. Renjiro simply nodded. Kazuo began to walk back toward the road, but then turned once more. "Will you carry it again tomorrow?" Renjiro looked to the mountain. "No," he said. "Today was the last time." Kazuo blinked. "Why?" The old man looked at his hands. They trembled slightly, but were at peace. "Because today someone else carried it, and in doing so reminded me that I no longer need to." For the first time, he walked away from the stone, and the mountain, in its silent wisdom, let him go. Story 8. The Bell That Would Not Ring Thee. Temple bell was cracked. It hung heavy and silent in the courtyard of Mount Yorin Temple, a great bronze relic from a century past, its surface inscribed with the Sacred Heart Sutra, weathered by snow and sun. No one remembered exactly when it had fallen silent. Some said it had been during the war, others during the Great Quake. But one thing was certain. It no longer sang. Abbot Isho had tried everything. Craftsmen from the valley inspected it. Priests from Kyoto came and offered chants. Even a monk from Nepal tried striking it with a sandalwood mallet, hoping the scent of devotion might wake it. Nothing worked. The bell remained mute, a beautiful ghost in the wind, and so it became a symbol, not of loss, but of endurance. The villagers continued their pilgrimages, bowing beneath the bell as if it still spoke. Children whispered to it, offering prayers to ancestors. Lovers touched its rim before parting for work in the cities. Silence had become part of its power. Then, one spring, a young man named Takao arrived. He was thin, with long fingers and a permanent squint, as though always peering through dust. He wore no robe, only simple work clothes, and he bowed awkwardly to the abbot, hands stained with soot. "I heard you have a bell," he said. "We do," the abbot replied, "but it does not ring." Takao smiled. "Then it is waiting," said little else. The villagers assumed he was a blacksmith, or maybe a restorer from the city. But Takao did not bring tools. He came with a small satchel and a worn book of sutras. Every morning he circled the bell, whispering to it. Sometimes he touched it, pressing his ear against the cold metal. Other times he sat beneath it, staring at the mountains. "It does not need fixing," he said one day to the abbot. "It needs listening." The monks were puzzled. So was Issho, but he allowed it. For weeks, Takao did nothing but observe. He slept in the bell tower, even during snow. He fasted, and when villagers offered him rice, he offered them stories instead about a bell in a desert that rang without wind, or one in Korea that rang only when a lie was told. But always, the bell of Mount Yorin remained silent. One night, a storm swept through the valley. Lightning cracked trees. The air shimmered with electric dust. The monks gathered indoors, reciting chants to steady their nerves. But Takao stood outside, beneath the bell, soaked and shaking. "Speak," he whispered. Just once, the wind howled. The trees bowed, and then nothing. At dawn, he was still there, eyes bloodshot, lips cracked. The abbot approached him with a blanket and tea. "Come inside, Takao. You'll fall ill." Takao took the cup, but did not drink. "Why doesn't it ring?" he asked. "Why has it forgotten its voice?" Issho sat beside him. "Perhaps it has not forgotten. Perhaps it has simply said all it needed to." Takao looked down. "Then why am I still here?" The abbot studied him. "You tell me." Takao said nothing. The next day, Takao disappeared. No goodbye, no note. His satchel remained, along with the book of sutras. Only the cracked bell remained unchanged, looming like a moon fallen to earth. Spring turned to summer, then autumn. One morning, months later, a boy named Ren came running to the temple. He was breathless, eyes wide. "I heard it," he shouted. "The bell, it rang." The monks laughed. Perhaps a dream, but the boy insisted. Just once, at dawn, so they checked. Dust covered the mallet, and the air was still. But something was different. The abbot placed his hand on the bell's side. It was warm, as if it had been touched by sun or spirit. That night, the abbot could not sleep. He sat alone under the bell. Crickets sang, and the moon painted silver on the grass. "It rang for the boy," he said aloud, "but not for me." Then he saw it, just under the base of the bell, etched not with a chisel but a nail, were faint characters. A haiku. "No one hears the bell until silence becomes loud in the waiting heart." It was Takao's handwriting. The abbot recognized it from the sutra book. He closed his eyes and bowed. Days passed, then weeks. The bell never rang again, not by wind or mallet, but the villagers began to change. People who had never spoken began greeting one another at the temple. Old feuds dissolved in shared silence beneath the bell. Children would stand beneath it and say nothing, just breathing. their faces soft with wonder. A woman who had lost her child came every morning to sit beside the bell. Not to weep, not to pray, only to sit. After weeks, she began to smile again. Farmer who was going to sell his land for debt sat by the bell for 7 nights and changed his mind. He began teaching young apprentices instead. The bell became more than sound. It became space. It became witness. One day, an old blind man came to the temple. He had been walking for days. When the monks asked what brought him, he said, "I dreamed of a bell that does not ring. I heard its silence." He stayed for a week. Every evening he'd sit beside it and hum not melodies, but tones. He'd tap the ground with his cane and smile. Before he left, he said, "There is no crack, only an opening." Years passed. The bell never rang again, but it was not silent, and one day, long after the abbot had passed and the temple had aged into a relic itself, another traveler arrived. A girl with ink-stained fingers and a heart heavy with grief. She said nothing to the monks, only bowed, and sat beneath the bell. And for the first time in decades, it rang, not a thunderous sound, but a single, soft, note-like breath, leaving the lips of someone who has been holding it for too long. The monks ran. The villagers froze. The girl did not move. When they asked her what she had done, she said, "I just stopped trying." They begged her to do it again. She smiled and shook her head. "It only rings when it wants to." She said. She left the next morning. The bell never rang again, but now, every year, on the first day of spring, the monks sit silently beneath it. And always, someone, child, elder, stranger, will feel something, not a sound, not a vibration, just a knowing, the kind of knowing that lives between what is said and what is meant, the kind of knowing that does not need to ring because it has already been heard. Story 9. The carpenter's daughter too was a carpenter. Not just any carpenter. He was known throughout 3 provinces for crafting the most flawless doors. Doors that closed with the gentlest whisper. Doors that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. Doors that breathed as if alive. There was something about his craftsmanship that couldn't be taught, but Tetsu was growing old. His back no longer straightened fully after hours of sawing. His hands, once sure as hawks, trembled slightly when holding the plane. His apprentices whispered that he should retire, that his eyes no longer aligned the wood grain quite right. He heard them, he forgave them. They did not understand. He was not building doors, he was building silence, stillness, the thing between the rooms, between the people. Every joint, every dowel was a question. One day, a man named Lord Esano summoned Tetsu. His estate sat at the edge of a pine forest and was renowned for its opulence. Tetsu arrived with a bag of tools, bowed to the guards, and entered the long, tiled hall. Lord Asano was waiting. He wore brocade robes, too heavy for summer, and a face that didn't move even when he smiled. "I want you to build me a door," said the Lord. Tetsu nodded. "What kind of door?" Asano clasped his hands. "A door that cannot be opened." Tetsu paused. "Then what is its purpose?" "That is for me to decide. I want a door that none may enter, nor leave through. I want it sealed yet still. I want it to look like a door. Beautiful, unassuming, untouched." Tetsu bowed. "Then I will make it." He did not ask why. He never asked why. Clients often built things out of grief, pride, or madness. His task was not to interpret, only to craft. For 3 weeks, Tetsu stayed at the estate. He refused assistance, working late into the night. humming quietly to the grain of the wood as if speaking to an old friend. But as he worked, he began to notice odd things. The hall where the door was to be placed was utterly silent, more so than silence should be. No footsteps, no passing voices. Even the birds outside the nearby window did not perch on the sill. Something waited behind the future door, something that wished not to be disturbed. Still, Tetsu worked. He shaped the door from hinoki wood, fragrant and pure. He lacquered it with oil from sesame and camellia seeds, rubbed smooth with his own sleeve. When he was done, the door was so perfect it vanished into the wall unless you looked for it. Lord Izuno came to inspect it. His eyes narrowed. "It's beautiful." Tetsu said nothing. "It can't be opened." Tetsu nodded. "Not by hinge, not by key, not by force." Lord Isano smiled, then turned to leave. Later that night, a servant, one of the few who dared speak with the old carpenter, whispered over a bowl of soup, "You should not have come." Tetsu sipped carefully. "She's behind the door," said the servant, eyes trembling. His daughter. Tetsu looked up. "They say she fell in love with a simple hand. They tried to run away. He caught them. The boy was never found. The girl Lady Suri was never seen again. But her room, it's behind that door." Tetsu said nothing. He did not need to. He'd known. The silence spoke. The next day, before leaving, he went to the door. He placed his palm upon the wood. It was warm. "You are still here," he whispered. That evening, as he descended the hill from the estate, the wind shifted. He did not turn back. Some doors should never be built. Some, once made, remain in us long after we walk away. Years passed. Tetsu no longer took commissions. He lived quietly, carving small boxes, spoons, sometimes kites for children who didn't know his name. He began to forget the door, or perhaps he only pretended. Until one day, a rider came. "Lord Isano is dead." Tetsu, now hunched and white-haired, blinked slowly, and the door. "It is still shut, but there is something." They rode together in silence, passing fields golden with harvest. The estate had withered in opulence. Moss grew between the tiles. The servants were gone. Inside, in the long hallway, the door remained untouched, but now there were marks, fingernail scratches on the inside. "Tets, you touched the surface gently." The wood trembled, faintly, under his hand. He stepped back. "I built this," he said aloud, though no one stood near. "I sealed a soul." At night, he lay awake in the guest chamber. He thought of Shiori, a girl whose name he never knew, whose story he only brushed by. What right had he to build silence where truth should have screamed? He rose before dawn. By the time the sun crested the hills, the door lay in pieces. He had disassembled it without violence, only care. Each dowel removed like a memory unthreaded. Behind it there was nothing, no room, no chamber. Just stone, wall. He blinked. He touched the back of the wooden frame. It was solid, immovable. There never was a door, or perhaps the door was always inside them all. Years later, a monk visited Tetsu's grave. It was unmarked, save for a small carving of a door etched in stone. The monk bowed and said a silent prayer. He had once been the stable hand. Left for dead in the woods, he had survived. Taken in by mountain monks, he had become a quiet man. He often thought of Suri, and sometimes, in dreams, he would see a door, perfect door standing in a field of wind. It never opened. It didn't need to, because on the other side of it, there was no anger, no grief, no shame, only light. Story 10. The bell that never rang the mountain temple of Ryazan was quiet even in the wind. It stood at the edge of the cliff, overgrown with moss and thyme, where the bells had long since fallen silent. In the morning mist, the young acolyte, named Nari, lit incense before the empty altar and bowed 3 times. She was only 17, newly arrived from the south. Her head was freshly shaved. Her robes still smelled of dyed cotton, but her heart was as restless as a river in monsoon. She had come to Ryazan not out of faith, but necessity. Her father, a rice merchant, had taken his life after bankruptcy. Her mother had grown silent and sick, with nowhere else to go and no appetite for the world's noise. Nari followed the path to the temple, hoping that silence would carry some kind of answer. But weeks passed, and the silence only grew heavier. There were only 4 monks remaining at Ryazan. The abbot, master, Ensu, was old and slow-moving. His back curved like the temple's eaves. He rarely spoke. The others did chores and sat in zazen. No one explained anything to her. No one asked why she had come. They only pointed toward the meditation hall and said, "Sit, breathe." Nari sat. She breathed. She waited. But even as the autumn leaves curled into themselves and winter arrived with its clear, brittle air, she remained restless. In the early mornings, she walked behind the temple where the old bronze bell hung, its surface darkened by lichen, a long wooden beam suspended beside it. She had never heard it ring. "Why don't we ring the bell?" she asked a cook one day. "It hasn't rung in over 50 years, the cook replied, not looking up. "Not since the war." "Why?" The old master said it should only ring when a heart becomes truly silent. Nari frowned. What did that mean? She had come here to silence her heart, hadn't she? To quiet the grief and the shame that haunted her even in sleep. But the more she sat in meditation, the more her thoughts grew louder. Her father's face before the end, her mother's distant eyes, the neighbor's whispers, the old life unraveling like thread. She begged the silence for peace, but the silence gave her nothing. One night, she crept out of the temple and stood before the bell. The moon cast a long shadow over the beam. She stared at it, her breath making clouds in the air. What does a truly silent heart feel like? She whispered. No answer came, just the wind. She wanted to ring it. She wanted to hear the sound echo down the valley. Something, anything, to break the stillness that had become unbearable. But she did instead, she knelt and sat beneath the bell, closing her eyes, her hands resting in her lap. She began to breathe. 1 breath, 2, 10, 50, 100. The night passed around her at dawn. She opened her eyes. Nothing had changed. Asterisk, asterisk over the weeks that followed. Nari began to observe more closely. She watched the abbot's slow movements, how he fed the koi fish one by one with quiet care, how he swept the garden without looking at the ground, how he bowed to the plum tree before trimming its branches. One afternoon, she approached him while he was sitting beneath the old ginkgo tree. "Master Ensu," she said softly. He turned, his eyes barely open. "I want to know how to silence my heart," she said. "Why? So I can ring the bell." The old master smiled, a motion so slight it barely moved his face. "You do not silence the heart by force," he said. "You listen to it until it is ready." She frowned. "I've been listening for months. All I hear is noise." "Then keep listening. That's it. That's it." She bowed and turned to leave. But then she stopped and turned back. What if the heart never becomes silent? He looked up toward the bell tower in the distance. Then, the bell will remain silent too. That is not failure. That is truth. **** Spring came with the fragrance of wildflowers, and Ryazan began to thaw. Nari stayed, not because she had found peace, but because she no longer needed to leave. One day, a traveler arrived, a businessman who had lost everything in the city's economic collapse. His clothes were expensive, but his face was pale. He stayed 3 days, seeking advice from Master Ensu, then left without a word. Later, Nari found a crumpled note left. Near the garden well, there is no such thing as quiet, only deeper listening. She folded the note and placed it inside her sleeve. ****. The days passed like wind through reeds. One morning, Nari was sweeping the steps when she heard a cry from beyond the trees. She rushed down the path to find a young woman, barely older than herself, kneeling beside a still body. A child, no more than 6, lay limp in her arms, his lips blue. "We were hiking," the woman sobbed. "He slipped. He hit his head. He's not breathing." Nari knelt beside them, placing her fingers to the boy's neck. There was no pulse. But instead of panic, she felt something rise, an old ache, familiar but distant. She closed the boy's eyes and held the mother's hand. "No words," she whispered. "Just breathe." The woman clung to her. She cried until the wind picked up. They brought the boy to the temple. Master Ensu prepared the rites. Nari sat beside the grieving mother that night, no longer searching for answers, only bearing witness. In the morning, the woman said, "I don't know how I'll go on." "You will," Nari said, her voice even, "and someday the ache will become part of your silence." "How do you know?" Nari looked toward the bell tower. "I don't, but I'm still here." That evening, as the monks gathered for their usual zazen, Nari did not enter the hall. Instead, she walked alone behind the temple. The bronze bell gleamed in the fading light. She stood before it for a long time, her eyes closed. She listened to the rustling of the trees, the breath in her chest, the ache in her bones, the faint memory of her father's voice, laughing long ago, the image of the grieving mother's face, the weight of all the things she could never change. And then she pulled the rope. The beam swung slowly. The bell rang. The sound was low, deep, as if rising from the bottom of the earth. It traveled down the valley like mist, lingering in the hollows, resting on leaves. In the meditation hall, Master Ensu looked up. The monks paused. In stillness, no one said a word. The bell had rung, not because the heart was empty, but because it was full. Story 11. The Window of Ashes. In the far north of a remote Japanese prefecture, nestled between 2 winding rivers and shadowed by towering cypress trees, there was an abandoned schoolhouse made of grey stone and iron-rimmed windows. The villagers called it the Window of Ashes. They never spoke of it in daylight, and children were told to stay away. Yet each winter, a lantern was seen glowing through one window, flickering like a memory refusing to fade. Few remembered the girl who once lived there. Her name was Aya. Had once been a schoolteacher in the early 1940s, the only child of a weaver and a part-time potter. She grew up in a small hut near the edge of the riverbank. Her laughter had been known to echo through the entire village. She had a way of stopping to listen even when no one else noticed the breeze rustling through maple leaves, or the faintest song of frogs when snow began to thaw. When the war reached the quiet village, young men were taken, fathers drafted, and schools emptied. But Aya stayed. She taught the remaining children, orphans, abandoned, the secreting poems on rice paper, folding history into stories, wrapping arithmetic inside songs. The village changed. It grew quieter, more hollow. Hunger etched itself into everyone's bones, and fear took root in the soil. One afternoon, a group of soldiers arrived, strangers in uniform, posted by the prefectural authority. They commandeered the schoolhouse. Aya was told to leave, but she refused. She pleaded, "This place is not a building. It's the last place they feel human," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. The captain listened but did not speak. He turned, barked orders, and the doors were locked behind her. That night, Aya stood outside in the snow, watching the window. A child inside Mako pressed her hand against the glass. The girl had been mute since her parents died, but she always stayed close to Aya, sketching birds with broken crayons. Now, her fingers slowly drew shapes on the fogged glass. As Aya stood helpless by dawn, the schoolhouse burned. The official report claimed it was sabotage by rebels, but villagers whispered of a different truth. The soldiers, they said, had lit the fire as punishment for hiding the children of suspected dissenters. Aya had run into the flames. She never came back. Only one child survived, Mako rescued by an old Zen monk, who would come down from the mountains the next morning. The monk took her in and raised her in a secluded temple, known only as Kizenji, the Mountain of the Empty Heart. Mako did not speak for 5 years. The monk, who went only by his Dharma name, Genshin, never asked her to. Instead, they raked sand gardens in silence. They watched plum blossoms fall. They listened to cicadas scream and die. One summer morning, Mako picked up a brush and began to paint again. Her first piece was of a charred window floating in the middle of a lake, with a girl's reflection seen not in the water, but inside the glass. Genshin looked at it, then asked only one question: "What is missing?" Mako sat in silence for a long while. Then, for the first time in years, she whispered, her voice. Genshin smiled. "That is your cone." Years passed. Mako grew into a young woman and later returned to the village with her teacher's robes. The villagers, now aged and sorrowful, barely remembered her. They spoke of Aya as myth, as tragedy, as a story softened by time. But Mako reopened the schoolhouse. It had long since been repaired, abandoned again, and reclaimed by moss and silence. Yet one window still bore the faintest shadow of ash where Mako had once pressed her hand. She began teaching once more, but instead of arithmetic and letters, she taught silence. Each morning, children gathered to sweep the floors and sit in stillness. They did not chant. They did not pray. They listened. Silence is not the absence of sound, Mako would say. It is the presence of what matters. One boy, Kato, once asked, "But Io-sensei died in fire. Doesn't silence make us forget?" Mako shook her head gently. "No, words forget. Silence remembers." One day, an elderly visitor came to the schoolhouse, cloaked in worn robes. He watched from afar, then approached Mako at dusk. "You carry your teacher's bones in your breath," he said. She bowed. "Are you get?" The old monk smiled, but said nothing. That night, they shared tea. Mako confessed a dream that haunted her still. "I see her in that window, always behind the flame. I reach out, but my fingers go through her. I want her voice back." Genshin nodded. Double quotes. "Do you know the Zen saying, when the wind blows through the reeds?" Whose voice is it? Mako closed her eyes. The wind's. No, he said. Yours. She wept, but not from sadness, from recognition. In the years that followed, the schoolhouse became a temple. Travelers came not to study books, but to learn to sit and breathe, to cry without shame, and to remember those they'd lost, not with words, but with presence. One traveler, an American poet, asked Mako during her last season on Earth, "Why did you never rebuild the window?" She looked at the ashes still faint on the sill, untouched for decades. "Because some windows are meant to remain open," she said, "even when broken. And so the temple remains, and every winter a single lantern is lit behind the old window. Some say it's the spirit of Aya. Others say it's the fire of those still searching. But those who have sat there in silence know better. It is the voice of the wind, speaking through reeds and memory, calling us to be still enough to hear ourselves, not the voice that talks, the one that listens." Story 12. The sound of the shattered cup in the silent village of Hoshimura, nestled deep in the forested foothills of the north. There lived a master potter named Kiji. His hands were famed across provinces for shaping earth into vessels that seemed to hum with life. Each teacup he made was balanced perfectly between utility and spirit, thin as air, resilient as oak bark, and adorned with a glaze that captured morning mist. To drink from Kiji's cups was said to taste not just tea, but time, wind, memory. Yet Kiji was no monk. He never shaved his head, never spoke in riddles, never sat in meditation. He woke at dawn, worked clay until dusk, and spoke only when necessary. He lived alone, his kill his companion, and he distrusted abstraction. Zen, to him, was not in talk, but in touch fingers in clay. Ash in the wind, heat on skin. One winter, a wandering monk named Ryosho arrived in the village. He had heard whispers of Kiji's work and came seeking a cup, not to possess, but to observe. Ryosho carried nothing but a travel robe, a staff, and a quiet presence. He entered Kiji's humble home and bowed low. "I seek a cup," he said. Simply, Kiji looked him over. "I sell none. I do not need to keep it. I wish to drink once from the cup of silence you have crafted." Kiji, curious despite himself, nodded. "Then drink." He handed the monk a cup, still warm from the kiln. Ryosho took it reverently, admired the subtle blue veins running beneath the glaze, like the last frost lines on spring soil. He drank. Green tea, steeped in silence. Then he did something unusual. He set the cup on the wooden floor beside him, not on the table, not in his lap, but on the floor. He stood, bowed again, turned to leave. A gust of wind slipped through the open door. The cup trembled. It rolled, tipped, and fell. The shattering was soft, yet sharp. A clean, crystalline snap that pierced both men's bodies in different ways. Kiji froze. Ryosho stopped at the doorway, still facing out toward the snow. He said nothing. He made no apology. He didn't move to pick up the shards. Kiji's face hardened. "You broke it." Ryosho remained still. "Yes." Kiji stepped forward. "That cup took a week to make. It held 3 generations of discipline. It held tea," the monk replied gently. Kiji's jaw tightened. "You placed it carelessly. I placed it with trust. It was the wind that took it. It is the cup that broke, not the wind." The silence grew heavy, like unglazed clay. Finally, Kiji gestured to the door. "Go," Ryosho bowed deeply once more and left without further word. For weeks, Kiji brooded. He swept the pieces but did not discard them. Instead, he placed the shards on a shelf above his workbench, where he could see them every day. They seemed to accuse him, or worse, remind him. He tried to remake the cup. Dozens of attempts followed. None captured the stillness of the original. Some warped in the fire. Others cracked as they cooled. One melted into itself, like a body forgetting its skeleton, one night. Exhausted and frustrated, Kiji sat alone with the shards and tea. He took each fragment in hand and examined it not as broken but as form. A lip of porcelain here, smooth. As a whisper, a jagged edge there, catching light like regret. A thought surfaced alien, absurd. He began reassembling the cup, not to hide the fracture, but to honor it. Using a technique he had never tried, he fused the shards with lacquer, dusted. In gold kintsugi, the art of golden joinery, the veins of gold glimmered like scars worn with pride. When he finished, the cup looked reborn, as if the break had allowed it to become truer, more honest. Not perfect, but radiant. He set the cup on his table and wept. Spring came, the forest softened, flowers stretched, the kill's breath warmed. Kiji's work changed. The new cups had echoes of the broken one. Some bore subtle gold veins on purpose. Others seemed to lean into asymmetry, embracing imperfection like a form of grace. The villagers noticed. They said the cups now had more soul. Even those who had collected Kiji's early works came to him seeking newer ones. One morning, Ryosho returned. Kiji said nothing. He simply poured tea into the mended cup and handed it to the monk. Ryosho examined the golden scars. "You kept it. I broke it," Kiji replied. Ryosho smiled. "I drank from silence, and now it sings." They drank in peace. Later, Ryosho shared a story. There was once a Zen master, he began, who carried a bowl he loved more than any sermon. He ate from it every day. One evening, a novice dropped it. The bowl shattered. The master looked at the boy, smiled, and said, "Now I am free." Kiji listened without nodding, but his hand rested on the cup, thumb brushing the golden seam. Ryosho asked, "Would you make another like this?" "No," Kiji said. "Each break is its own teacher." As the sun set over Hoshimura, shadows moved gently across the room. The mended cup caught the light, gold glinting like wisdom earned through pain, not avoided. In the dance of brokenness and beauty, Kiji had found his Zen, and he kept pouring tea. Story 13. The bowl that refused to shatter in a narrow street of Kyoto, where small tea shops leaned quietly into each other like sleepy monks. There was a pottery studio known as the Silent Wheel. Its owner, Master Sora, was a man of few words and deep silences. His fame had spread throughout the city, not because he sold much, he rarely did, but because each of his bowls was considered a meditation in clay. He never made two alike, and he never explained their meaning. One summer morning, a wealthy businessman named Koji arrived in a black car, its tires whispering over the old stones. He was dressed immaculately, hair slicked back, wrists heavy with gold. He entered the studio, looked around at the shelves filled with bowls, each one with a chip, a crack, a scar, and frowned. "Where is your perfect work?" Koji asked. "Master." Sora stood still, wiping his hands on a linen cloth, his face unreadable. "Perfection is the silence after the bowl sings," he replied cryptically. Koji didn't like riddles. He had come because he'd heard that the bowls held something mystical, something that might bring him peace, or control, or power. He was tired of deals and deadlines, of family dinners filled with silence and shallow toasts. He wanted something true, something no one else had. Sora offered him tea. As they sat, Koji noticed a single bowl placed on a small pedestal behind the master, a bowl unlike the others. It was smooth, uncracked, and glowed faintly in the morning light, like it had been bathed in moon water. That one, Koji said, pointing. I want it. Sora glanced at the bowl, then at Koji. It is not for sale. Everything is for sale. Then it is not a thing. Koji laughed, but there was no mirth in it. He stood, reached into his jacket, and took out a thick envelope. This should suffice. Sora did not look at the money. The bowl chooses who may carry it. Not I. The businessman clenched his jaw. Then test me. Without answering, Sora rose and walked to the back of the shop. He returned with a tray on it, 5 bowls, each with a subtle difference. One was glazed in ash, another in gold dust. One with a spiral crack stitched by silver lacquer. The last had a single drop of red near the rim. Carry each bowl to the shrine at the top of Mount Hiei, alone, one each day. If none shatters, the last will be yours. Koji scoffed. I could send my assistant. You may, but the bowls, no. That evening, Koji dismissed his driver, packed lightly, and the next morning began his climb. He carried the first bowl, the ash-glazed one, in both hands. The climb was steeper than he expected. He cursed the heat, the bugs, the slippery rocks. When he finally reached the mossy shrine, the bowl was cracked. The second day, he tried again, slower, calmer, but a root caught his foot. He stumbled, the bowl chipped. The third, he focused on his breath. His steps even whispered mantras. But at the peak, the bowl had a hairline fracture that hadn't been there before. By the 4th day, something had shifted. He woke before dawn, listened to birdsong, smelled the pine, held the bowl gently, as if it were the hand of his daughter. At the top, it was intact. For the first time, he smiled. The 5th day arrived. The red drop bowl. He took it as if holding the heartbeat of the mountain itself. He walked not with intention, but attention, aware of wind, of ants on branches, of the cloud that moved like breath across sky. When he reached the shrine, he placed the bowl down and sat beside it, watching the trees move. It did not shatter. He stayed there until nightfall. Something inside him, a knot he didn't know was there, began to loosen. When he returned to the studio, Sora waited. The businessman bowed deeply, wordlessly. The bowl has chosen, Sora said, handing him the smooth, glowing vessel. Koji looked into it. It was still and quiet. Back in Tokyo, the bowl sat on a wooden shelf. His family asked nothing of it. Visitors admired it, but Koji never explained it. Sometimes he'd sit before it at night, breathing slowly, hands open on his knees. Years later, his son would find the bowl in a box after Koji's passing. It looked ordinary, but when he held it, he wept. Zen parable within the story. A monk asked the master, "What is truth?" The master held out a bowl. It holds tea. But do not mistake the bowl for the tea. Philosophical reflection. Perfection often seduces us into craving the unbroken. But Zen teaches that the cracks, the chips, the quiet losses, they are what invite light in. When we demand control, we break what we hold. When we attend gently with presence, the object and the self both remain whole. Koji believed he sought a perfect object. But what he truly sought was a perfect presence, and in learning to carry a fragile thing, he learned to carry his own mind. Psychological reflection. We live in an era of relentless striving for status, acquisition, image. But the nervous system, like the bowl, is delicate. When forced, it splinters. What Koji underwent was not a test of endurance, but a gradual return to embodiment, to mindfulness, to self. The bowl mirrored his state, shattered when he was impatient, whole when he was aligned. Healing, like carrying a bowl up a mountain, is not a task. It is an attunement. Meditative closing. Tonight, you may sit quietly with your hands open, as if holding a bowl, not to fill it, not to own it, just to feel the curve of emptiness. Ask yourself, what am I carrying, and how am I carrying it? And listen, not for an answer, but for the silence that sings when the bowl is whole. Story 14. The soundless drummer Monk John lived alone in a modest hut atop Mount Horai. Far from the noise of the world, no bells rang there, no students gathered to copy his words. He had no disciples, no shrine, no altar, only a wooden bench, a fire pit, and a drum without a skin. The villagers below often whispered about the mad monk of the mountain. Some claimed he spoke to clouds, others believed he could hear things that did not make a sound. But none dared climb the mountain, not until a man named Riku came in search of silence. Riku had once been a court musician in the capital. Applause had rained upon him like cherry blossoms. Yet the louder the acclaim, the emptier he felt. One night, after playing a flawless symphony, he stood alone in the echoing hall and realized that he had not heard a single note of his own. The silence terrified him, so he left. He walked for weeks through forests and fields, guided only by rumors and a longing he could not name. When he arrived at the mountain, his feet were bleeding, but something inside him was finally quiet. He climbed. At the summit, he found the hut. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney. A monk sat cross-legged on a flat rock, staring at a leaf caught in the wind. Riku bowed. "I've heard you have a drum that does not sound." Ijen turned his head slightly, but said nothing. Riku continued. "I played music all my life, but I do not know what silence is. I want to learn." Still, Ijen remained quiet. Then, with a motion like a falling leaf, he rose and walked into his hut. After a few minutes, he returned, holding the drum without a skin. He set it between them. "Strike it," he said. Riku blinked. "But it cannot make a sound." Ijen's eyes gleamed. "Strike it." Hesitantly, Riku lifted his hand and tapped the rim. A dull thud, like wood on wood. No tone, no vibration, only absence. Ijen watched him. "What did you hear?" "Nothing," Riku said. "It's broken." "Then you have not listened." That night, Riku slept beside the fire in Ijen's hut. The wind moaned through the cracks in the walls. An owl hooted in the distance. Riku lay awake, disturbed not by the noise but by the space between sounds. In the days that followed, Riku remained on the mountain. Each morning, Ijen would ask him to strike the drum, and each morning Riku would comply. Thud, pause, nothing. Again, until one day, something changed. Riku struck the drum, and in that moment of silence after the strike, he suddenly noticed the rustle of pine needles, the hush of distant snowmelt, the soft exhale of his own breath. He turned to Ijen. "I heard it." The monk smiled. "The drum never made a sound. It only revealed what was always there. They sat together for hours in stillness. Zen parable interlude there. Was once a man who wanted to understand the sound of one hand clapping. He visited temples, read sutras, and meditated day and night. Frustrated, he finally approached a blind old woman who lived at the edge of a stream. She handed him a bowl of water. "Strike this," she said. He did. The water rippled. "Now," she whispered. "Drink." As he sipped, the ripples vanished. In that quiet, he realized the answer had never been in sound, but in stillness. Philosophical reflection. Ajin's drum is a metaphor for the teachings of Zen itself. It offers nothing external, no melody, no doctrine, no spectacle, like the unstruck bell or the cone without answer. Its power lies not in performance, but in presence. Modern life teaches us to chase noise, achievement, commentary, entertainment. These things crowd our awareness. But in the absence of sound, a subtler world emerges. The whisper of intuition, the flicker of perception, the breath between thoughts. The soundless drum is not silent because it is broken. It is silent because it refuses to distract. It invites the listener not to hear, but to listen. True silence is not the absence of sound, it is the fullness of attention. Psychological reflection from a therapeutic perspective. Riku's transformation mirrors the journey from external validation to internal awareness. Like many of us, Riku associated identity with performance. His art, though beautiful, had become noise that drowned his inner life. His encounter with the soundless drum disrupted his pattern of response. It denied him the dopamine of applause. It stripped away the cues of success. In their place, it offered only space in which his fragmented self could reassemble in trauma therapy. There is a similar practice, to return attention gently to the body, the breath, the moment, not to interpret or judge, but simply to notice. Over time, this reactivates the brain's ability to regulate itself, to process emotion without reactivity. Ajin's method is one of experiential mindfulness. He does not explain, he does not interpret, he only invites practice. The wisdom arises not from instruction, but from the listener's own silence. Meditative closing. Close your eyes. Imagine a drum placed before you, not of leather, but of wood, unstrung and bare. Raise your hand, strike it once, then listen, not for sound, but for what remains. The distant hum of a passing breeze, the quiet echo of your own heartbeat, the sacred presence of a world, unfiltered. Let that be your teacher today, not the words you hear, but the space between them. As the old Zen saying goes, the silence after the bell is the true sound of awakening. Story 15. The Garden of the Forgotten Path in the highlands of northern Kyoto, where mist gathers like a prayer on the lips of the mountain. There once stood a forgotten Zen temple named Suikuin, the Temple of Reflected Light. Its roof was moss-covered, its walls crumbled with age, and its path was no longer walked by pilgrims. Yet within its garden bloomed irises and peonies with wild, unrestrained grace, as though time had never dared to silence their colors. The temple had only one resident, an old monk named Guinan. He was so quiet and still that villagers called him the stone who breathes. Guinan never descended the mountain, nor did he speak to those who dared visit, but it was said that his silence carried more compassion than 1,000 sermons, and his gaze could make even a weeping man smile. One spring, a young man named Daiki made his way up the winding trail to Suiku. His face was thin and drawn, eyes burdened by a grief too vast for his 25 years. He carried nothing but a worn satchel and a small wooden box bound in twine. At the gate, he hesitated, his body trembling as though the very ground beneath him might reject his presence. Guinan did not speak when he saw him. He merely opened the gate, bowed low, and gestured toward the garden. For 3 days, Daiki did not utter a word. He sat beneath the twisted branches of the camellia tree, eyes fixed on the ripples of the pond or the delicate pattern of fallen petals. Each evening, Guinan left a simple bowl of rice and pickled radish at his side, and each morning the bowl was empty. On the 4th day, Daiki finally spoke. "My brother died," he said softly, as though confiding in the wind. Jayan did not respond. He was a teacher, gentle, patient. Everyone loved him. Daiki's voice cracked. "I was the angry one, the one who fought, the one who drank too much, but he never raised his voice, not once." Guinan poured tea into 2 stone cups and handed one to the young man. They drank in silence. He drowned saving a child who fell into the river during a flood. Daiki's eyes glazed. He couldn't swim, but he went in anyway, pulled the boy out, and then his sentence vanished into the stillness. Guinan stood and beckoned Daiki to follow. They walked together into the deeper part of the garden where the path was overtaken by grass and moss. There stood a withered cherry tree, its limbs skeletal, yet around its base bloomed wild herbs and violet flowers. "Do you see this tree?" Guinan finally spoke, his voice like wind brushing over stones. "It does not bloom. Its fruit is gone. Its bark splits like broken skin. But beneath its feet, life stirs, and in its shadow, even the weeds soften." Daiki furrowed his brow. "But it's dying," Guinan smiled. "Yes, and in dying, it teaches the soil how to nourish. Not all gifts come in youth or strength. Some are born in surrender." That night, Daiki could not sleep. He sat by the pond and opened the small wooden box. Inside was a photograph of 2 boys laughing, muddy from fishing in the stream near their childhood home. There was also a folded letter, never sent, filled with apologies, half-finished thoughts, and aching silence. The next morning, he handed the letter to Guinan. "I wrote this to my brother, but I never gave it to him. I was always waiting for the right time." Guinan read it slowly, then nodded. Double quotes. "Bury it," he said. "Not in the ground, but in your actions." Daiki didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "Every word you did not say, say it through your hands. Every sorrow, turn it into something useful. The past is not a place to live. It is a garden from which you choose which seeds to carry." For the next several months, Daiki remained at Suiku. He rose with the sun and swept the temple steps. He learned to rake the gravel into meditative waves, to prune the plum trees without forcing their shape, to boil water until he heard the whispering dragon sound that Guinan taught him to recognize. One morning, while cutting away vines that had overtaken a path behind the temple, Daiki discovered a gate hidden beneath the overgrowth. Beyond it lay a forgotten courtyard, choked by weeds and silence. In the center stood an old stone bench and what remained of a dry fountain. "Why is this sealed off?" Daiki asked. Guinan paused. "That was the novice garden, where children, once trained, before the temple emptied, before the war." "Can I restore it?" Daiki asked. Guinan simply said, "If your heart desires to remember without clinging, every day Daiki labored in the garden. He hauled stones, cleared weeds, built a new bamboo fence, and replanted the earth with chrysanthemums and mountain sage. He placed a small wooden sign at the entrance, Niwa Numishi Wazura, to the garden of the forgotten path. But as the garden came to life, Ginnen began to fade. His steps slowed, his hands trembled, and he often sat longer than he spoke. One evening, as the bell of dusk echoed across the hills, Daiki found Ginnen sitting beneath the withered cherry tree, eyes closed, breath shallow. "I have something for you," Ginnen whispered. From his robe, he pulled a smooth stone. Upon it was carved the character Mu, meaning nothingness. "I carved this when I was your age. I thought I understood it then. I was wrong. I only understood when I stopped asking what it meant." Daiki held the stone in both hands. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice tight with grief. Ginnen opened his eyes. "You walk wherever the forgotten path leads." Ginnen passed that night. He left no will, no possessions, only a cup on the windowsill still half full, of tea and a garden that had learned how to breathe again. Daiki stayed for another year. Then, one misty morning, he put on the old monk's robe, took the wooden sign from the garden, and descended the mountain. He traveled from village to village, teaching children how to sit in silence and listen to the wind. He taught them how to bow before a stone, how to drink tea as though it were a sacred vow, and how to forgive even the versions of themselves they had once despised. They called him the monk who remembers, but he always laughed and said, "No, I am the one who forgot, and that is how I found the way." And so, in forgotten gardens, on overgrown paths, and in the trembling hands of those who suffer, the teachings of Suikuin bloomed again, not as dogma, not as scripture, but as quiet acts of kindness passed from breath to breath, like petals caught on the breeze. Story 16. The Mirror in the Mist. It was a quiet village, nestled in the heart of the mountain ranges where clouds danced. Upon treetops and mist lingered like ancient whispers. In this village, known as Kogen, lived an elderly man named Shin, who spent most of his days in silence, tending to his moss-covered garden and sipping tea by the paper windows of his wooden house. Some believed he was once a Zen master who had abandoned the temple life. Others said he had lost something so precious that words could no longer capture his sorrow. Every morning, Shinyo would walk to the edge of the forest and sit beneath the crooked pine tree. There, he would stare into the fog, motionless, as if waiting for something or someone. Children from the village whispered that he could see ghosts in the mist, but the elders knew better. He was watching himself. Years ago, Shinyo had been the abbot of a mountain temple. He had disciples, a reputation, and followers from faraway lands who came to learn the art of stillness. But there had been a moment, one brief, fatal moment, when he spoke in anger to a student who had broken a sacred mirror. The mirror was an heirloom from his master, said to reflect not faces, but the true mind. The student had tripped and fallen, and in that instant the mirror shattered. Shinyo, usually composed, lost his temper. He shouted, humiliated the young man, and cast him out of the temple. That night, the student vanished into the mountains. His body was never found. Years passed. Guilt burrowed deep into Shinyo's soul, as quiet and consuming as mountain moss. He left the temple, gave away his robes, and settled in Kogen. But every time the mist rolled in, it reminded him of the shattered mirror, of the broken trust, of the face of the boy whose name he could no longer say aloud. One evening, as the fog thickened around the pine tree, Shinyo noticed something unusual, a glint, like light bouncing off glass, deeper in the woods, compelled by something ancient. Within him, he followed it. The forest was silent, not even the chirp of a sparrow. His feet crunched on leaves and twigs as the fog coiled tighter, and then he saw it. A mirror, tall and wide, framed in dark wood, standing impossibly in the clearing. Its surface shimmered like water, but reflected nothing, no trees, no sky, not even Shinyo himself. He stepped closer. Still no reflection. And yet, he felt as if he were being seen, utterly and completely. The sensation unnerved him. He reached out, but dared not touch it. Then, a voice, soft and trembling. "Do you still carry it?" Shinyo turned, but no one was there, only mist and trees. "Carry what?" he asked aloud, his voice hoarse with disuse. "The anger," said the voice. "The guilt, the shame." Shinyo sank to his knees. "Yes," he whispered. "Every day." The mirror flickered, and then, slowly, it began to show a figure young, wearing the robes of a disciple, standing still, looking at him. "I never meant to break it," the boy said. "I know," Shinyo murmured, tears threading down his wrinkled cheeks. "You thought the mirror was sacred," said the boy. "But it was only glass. The real mirror is in you." At that, the figure faded, and Shinyo was alone again. But the guilt had shifted, not vanished, but softened, like how a sharp rock becomes smooth when cradled by river currents for many years. He returned the next day, and the day after. Each time, the mirror stood there, showing not his reflection, but his heart. Sometimes, it revealed the anger still coiled like a serpent inside him. Other times, it showed kindness, his gentleness with ants, his quiet smile to passing villagers, the warm tea he brewed with intention. Weeks turned into months. One morning, the mirror was gone. In its place was a stone pedestal with a single phrase carved into it. The mirror was never glass nor surface. It was your willingness to see. That day, Shinyo returned to the village, not as a sage, not as a former abbot, but as a simple man who had learned how to bow to his own reflection, not the one that showed his face, but the one that mirrored his mind. From then on, when the children asked about the mist and the forest, the elders would smile and say, "That's where people go to meet themselves." In time, Shinyo became a teacher, again not of doctrines or sutras, but of silence and honesty. He would sit with villagers and say nothing, and in that stillness, they often found their own voices. Zen, he came to understand, was not about escaping guilt or silencing the past. It was about daring to look, gently and honestly, into the mirror of one's own being, even when it showed things we wished not to see. And the greatest teaching he ever gave was this: the mind is a mirror not of truth, but of clarity. When the mist clears and the surface is still, you will see not who you are, but who you are becoming. That was enough. Story 17. The bell that never rang in a remote hillside monastery cloaked in mist and time. There hung an ancient bronze bell. It was said to be over 400 years old, cast by monks whose names had long faded from the temple records. The bell was large, taller than a man, and darker than the shadows at dusk. Though it stood silently in its wooden pavilion, suspended by thick ropes, its presence commanded reverence. Yet the bell had never rung. Generations came and went. Young monks arrived with shaved heads and hopeful eyes, and old monks left in silence, carried by the wind and the prayers of their brothers. But through all seasons and lifetimes, the bell remained untouched. Not because it was broken, but because of a vow. According to legend, the bell was forged during a time of great turmoil, when famine and war swallowed the countryside. Villagers fled to the monastery, desperate for shelter and food. The monks, already scarce in resources, gave everything they had: grain, blankets, and prayer. When the supplies ran out, one old monk walked barefoot through snow and thorn to reach the neighboring province, returning weeks later with rice and medicine. He collapsed at the temple gates and died that night. In honor of his sacrifice, the monks cast the bell, but they vowed never to ring it until the world truly needed its sound, until compassion itself was in peril, and so it remained, untouched, among the novices who arrived in the spring of the bellflower bloom. Was a boy named Now, small for his age. He was often overlooked, his voice barely rising above a whisper, but Now had something the others lacked, a strange, quiet curiosity that kept him awake under moonlight and made him ask questions the senior monks struggled to answer. He was the only one who dared to sit near the bell. Every morning after sweeping the temple floors, Now would walk to the pavilion and gaze at it. He would trace the etched lotus patterns on its sides, study the ancient inscriptions, and sometimes just sit in its shadow. One day, the old bellkeeper, a monk named Genjo, saw him and said, "That bell has heard more silence than sound. Do you know why?" Now nodded. "Because it's waiting." Genjo raised a brow. "Waiting for what?" "For us," Now answered. "To need what it means." The old monk chuckled. "And what does it mean?" Now didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe it means we've forgotten how to listen." That reply stayed with Genjo. Over the months, Now continued his chores, meditations, and studies, but always returned to the bell. He asked about its makers, about the wars, about the monk who died bringing rice. He even asked what the sound might be like, low and thunderous, or high and trembling like a flute lost in wind. One evening, news arrived. A nearby village had been ravaged by landslides. Dozens were dead. Survivors had begun making their way to the monastery. Chaos followed. Rooms were filled with crying children, wounded farmers, and elderly women who had carried their grief like bundles of straw. The monks moved quickly, offering rice and warmth, but it wasn't enough. Food stores dwindled, blankets ran out. Some villagers, in despair, began to steal from one another. A child was slapped by an angry man. Fights broke out near the gate. The monastery, once a place of peace, began to splinter. One night, Now slipped away to the bell. He stood in the pavilion under a grey, weeping sky. The rain fell in hushed sobs. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched the wooden striker hanging beside the bell. It was weathered, rough. He closed his eyes. Then came footsteps. Genjo appeared, drenched in robes and silence. He did not stop Now. Instead, he said, "Do you think this is the moment?" Now turned to him, eyes wide. "I don't know." "Then how will you decide?" Now looked at the bell, then at the horizon where morning waited beneath heavy clouds. "Don't want to ring it for hunger," he said, "or fear, or sorrow. Those come and go. But I saw a woman today give her only rice to a man who spat at her yesterday. She smiled, said he needed it more, and I saw the man cry for the first time." Guinness' face softened. "You think the bell should ring for compassion?" "I think it already is," Now whispered, "inside us. But maybe we need to hear it outside, too, to remind us." The old monk stepped aside, Now took a deep breath, raised the striker, and let it fall gently against the bell's bronze side. The sound was unlike anything he imagined. It was not loud. It did not shake the earth or frighten birds. It was soft, deep, and resonant, like the echo of a mountain breathing. It vibrated through stone, skin, and bone. It whispered into the soul. In the temple halls, monks froze. Villagers paused mid-argument. Even the children stopped crying. The bell's sound lingered long after it ceased. In that silence, people remembered. The next day, food was shared without tally. Blankets were sewn from robes. Prayers were offered not in chant, but in action. The monastery became not just a place of shelter, but a mirror for kindness. As for now, he continued his duties. But the bell was never rung again. It didn't need to be from that day on. Whenever a monk asked when the bell should be rung, Genji would say, "It rang once. It will echo forever." And the villagers who survived taught their children that compassion is not born in comfort, but in crisis. Not when things are easy, but when they're not. They said the sound of that bell lives in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before a kind word, in the decision to give, even when one has little. The bell remains in the pavilion still, quiet, waiting. But perhaps, just perhaps, its true ringing begins not with a sound, but with a choice. Story 18. The Glass Factory. In the far outskirts of a crumbling industrial town sat a glass factory once the pride of the region, now reduced to a ghost of hissing pipes and flickering fluorescent lights. Every morning, workers filed in through the rusted gates, their boots dragging, their lungs heavy with dust and old dreams. Among them was Bao, a man in his early 50s, narrow-eyed and lean, like someone who had lived on the edge of silence for too long. He had worked at the factory for 30 years, his hands coarse from heat and glass, his soul slowly etched into the rhythms of repetition. Bo never talked much, not because he was unfriendly, but because over the years he had found that words rarely changed anything. The younger workers knew Lin, and we often mocked him behind his back. To them, Bo was a relic, a symbol of submission, someone who let management walk all over him, who never questioned the dwindling wages, the unsafe equipment, or the missing benefits. They whispered words like coward and puppet. Bo heard them, but said nothing. He kept grinding down the corners of molten glass, day after day, under the ceaseless buzz of factory lights. One day, during the break, Nguyen slammed down his metal lunchbox on the communal table. "You hear," he said. "They're cutting. Pay again, but Bo won't care. He'd work for free if they asked." We snorted. He's like glass himself. Clear, fragile, invisible. Bo sat nearby, sipping his tea from a cracked cup. He didn't look up. Instead, he watched the steam rise and disappear into the heavy air. That evening, Bo walked home alone along the train tracks. His home was a one-room apartment above a noodle shop. Walls thin, memories thinner. His wife had passed years ago. His only son had moved abroad and rarely called. The apartment was filled with old books and one thing that glimmered with a different kind of light. A collection of hand-blown glass figurines, cranes, bowls, mountain scenes, all made by Bo, each one an act of quiet rebellion. On the shelf stood one unfinished pisa-tall vase, with a jagged crack running along its side. It had been like that for years, never fixed, never discarded. The next morning, a fire broke out in one of the main ovens. It was a minor blaze, but enough to spark panic. While others rushed toward the exit, Bo and Lin remained behind to shut off the fuel line. Lin's sleeve caught fire. Bo quickly smothered it with his own coat. No words passed between them, only heavy breath and trembling hands. Later, Lin approached Bao with red eyes. "Why'd you do that?" Bao shrugged. "The fire wasn't your fault." "No," Lin said. "I mean, why help me? After everything we've said." Bao looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Glass breaks when hit too hard, but sometimes it shatters because of a flaw no one saw coming. I know what it means to carry fractures." Lin fell silent. The fire became the tipping point. That week, workers gathered to demand change, hazard pay, safety repairs, fair wages. Nguyen, loud and defiant, was chosen to speak for them. He approached Bo one afternoon while Bo was cleaning his tools. "You coming to the meeting or hiding like always?" Bao didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, then at the smudged windows. "You want justice, but you're carrying anger, not clarity." Nguyen scoffed. "What's the difference?" Bo turned, his eyes steady. "Anger burns fast. Clarity burns long. One will make you scream. The other might make you heard." That night, Bo walked to the small Zen temple at the edge of town. He hadn't been there in years. The abbot, a woman named Sister Tin, recognized him immediately. "You've returned," she said. Bao bowed. "Not to pray, just to sit." And so he did. He sat in silence as the candlelight trembled in the wind, the incense smoke curling like forgotten questions. Sister Tin approached him quietly. "What burdens you, Bao?" He hesitated. "They want to fight, but they don't know how. They think I've given up. Maybe I have." She poured tea into 2 small cups. "You were always the one who listened. You taught yourself the art of glass, not just with fire, but with breath. That kind of patience isn't weakness, it's resistance." Bo lowered his gaze. "What good is resistance if it changes nothing?" She smiled softly. "Even the smallest crack changes how the light passes through." That night, Bao didn't sleep. He sat at his work table, turning the cracked vase in his hands. The fracture glowed faintly in the moonlight, and for the first time, he decided to finish it not by fixing the crack, but by making it the centerpiece. He filled it with molten glass again, carving waves around the fracture, embracing the imperfection. At the next workers' meeting, Bo showed up unexpectedly. Everyone stared. Nguyen muttered, "Here to watch." But Bo walked up to the center and placed the finished vase on the table. "This," he said, "was broken, but not ruined. Just needed a different shape." He paused, then looked at the room. "We want change," he said, "but we cannot scream and hope someone hears. We must shape it like glass, with heat, yes, but also control, vision." He proposed a plan not of rage, but of pressure. A written petition, safety data documented, a media contact Bo had from years ago, collective leave if demands weren't met. The workers were stunned. Slowly, they nodded. Bo wasn't a coward. He was a vessel waiting to pour. Weeks passed. The plan unfolded. Management, threatened by the attention, agreed to upgrades and partial raises. Bo never claimed credit. One evening, Nguyen came to Bo's apartment. He looked around at the glass figures, then at the cracked vase. "You taught yourself this?" he asked. "Yes," Bo replied. "When the factory was slow, I stayed late, not to work, to learn how to shape what could shatter." Nguyen nodded. "You're not like glass, you're like fire. Quiet, but steady." Bo smiled. "No, I am. Breath. Without it, Fire dies. Glass cools. Words fade. As Nguyen left, he paused at the door. You think things will change for good? Bo looked at the shelf. Maybe not the world, but the way we walk in it can. That night, Bao lit a single candle. Its flame danced inside the cracked vase, scattering light across the room. Not perfect, but beautiful. Story 19. The Song of the Iron Bellet was a village steeped in centuries of silence, wrapped between the low rolling hills and the lazy curve of the misty river. Here, time passed not in minutes or years, but in seasons and harvests, in weddings and funerals, in the cracks on weather-worn wood and the faded ink of old family records. The village was called Horin-Mora, which meant the village of the Dharma bell, and indeed, at the heart of the village stood an ancient iron bell, suspended beneath the moss-laden eaves of the old temple. No one knew who had cast it. Its surface bore no signature, only a worn inscription. When the bell rings, awaken the heart. But no one had heard it ring in over 100 years. The bell had long become symbolic silent, a reminder of something the villagers could not name. They whispered about it during ceremonies, swept around it during festival preparations, and the children, daring each other, sometimes reached up to touch its cold surface and dash away before the temple caretaker saw them. That caretaker was a man named Ichiro, old, bent, and bearded. He moved slowly through the temple grounds with a broom in one hand and time in the other. He had been orphaned in the war, taken in by the monks, and raised among sutras and incense. He never became a monk himself, he said. He lacked the clarity. But he had stayed on as a steward, devoted to the quiet life of maintaining stillness. Every morning before the sun rose, Ichiro would light incense in the main hall and sweep the stone paths around the bell. He'd stop, always, and look at it, sometimes placing a hand on its side, still sleeping. He'd murmur to the bell and then shuffle away. Then one winter, something changed. A woman arrived. She walked into the village from the south road, wrapped in a grey coat and a scarf that covered most of her face. Her eyes were dry, wide, and distant. She bowed to villagers politely, but kept her head low, asking for the temple and a place to stay. Ichiro found her kneeling in front of the bell before dawn. You should be indoors, he said, placing his broom down beside her. It's cold. She looked up. Her voice was quiet but steady. I want to hear the bell ring. Ichiro sat beside her. No one has rung that bell in over a century. Not since the war, I know, she said. But something tells me it's not done yet. He studied her face. Grief was etched into her skin like frost on bark. He saw a kind of hunger he hadn't seen in a long time. The hunger not for food or comfort, but for a sign, a signal, a rupture in the silence of her pain. You may stay at the temple, he said, but the bell, it rings only when the heart is ready to listen. Over the following weeks, the woman who introduced herself only as Aiko settled into the daily rhythms of temple life. She helped sweep, learned to light incense, served tea to the occasional visitors, and spent long hours sitting in the garden, watching the koi pond as if waiting for the water to speak. The villagers began to speak of her, too. She's hiding from something, one said. Maybe she lost someone, said another. She doesn't speak much, just watches. In truth, Aiko had lost everything. Her husband, Riku, had taken his own life just 2 months prior. No note, no signs, just the cold finality of absence. They had shared a quiet life in the city, both artists in their own right, he with music, she with painting. But when Riku had fallen into a long depression, Iko had mistaken his silences for a need for space. When she found him, it was too late. Since then, the world had felt hollow. People offered condolences, advice, even religion, but none of it reached her. She felt as if her ears were blocked with cotton, her chest packed with dust. Only silence made sense to her now. And in her dreams, she heard a bell ringing. She followed that dream to the village, and every day she returned to the bell. One morning, as spring began to lick at the frost, Ichiro brought her tea and sat beside her once again. "You know," he said, "the monks used to say the bell could awaken a soul caught in sorrow, but it never worked when forced. It rang when a heart let go." "Let go of what?" Iko asked. He looked up at the cherry tree above them, not yet in bloom. "Of trying to understand everything," he said. "Of clinging to guilt like it's a duty. Of punishing oneself for a mystery that has no answer." She was silent. "I thought if I had loved him better," she whispered, "he might have stayed." Ichiro didn't respond. He simply sipped his tea, then said, "He might have, he might not have. But here's what I know. Even those we love are traveling alone sometimes. Not even love can always enter their silence." That evening, Iko painted for the first time in months, a black canvas, then a slow swirl of white, rising like incense from the center. She didn't know what it was, only there's something inside. Her had begun to move. The next morning, as the sun rose over the misty hills, Ichiro was finishing his incense when he heard it, a low resonant hum. It was not loud, but it was deep, vibrating through the wood of the old floor, through the stones, through the still air of the courtyard. The bell was ringing. Ichiro rushed out, heart pounding, and there she was, Siko standing before the bell, a long wooden striker in hand. Her face streaked with tears, but her eyes, clear for the first time since she arrived. She had struck it once. She stepped back and listened. The sound went on and on low, warm, trembling with memory and release. Villagers emerged from their homes, gathering in awe as if called by something ancient. No one spoke. Some wept. Others smiled. Children stared, wide-eyed. When the sound faded, Iko bowed deeply to the bell. "I don't understand why he left," she whispered, tears falling freely now. "But I forgive him. I forgive myself." Ichiro stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've heard the bell," he said, "and now so have we all." From that day, the bell became more than a relic. It rang only once each year on the spring equinox when Iko would return. Now, living in a nearby town, her paintings increasingly filled with light. Each ring was different, but always it reminded the village, pain is not the end, grief is not a punishment, and silence, though heavy, carries within it the seed of sound. The bell, once silent for a century, had found its voice again, and through it, so had she. Story 20. The Silent Mirror. It was a little-known retreat hidden deep in the northern mountains of Japan. Travelers who found it rarely did so through maps or advertisements. Instead, they came through whispers, moments of intuition, or dreams they could not explain. The monks there rarely spoke. Their walls were undecorated, their meals simple, and their rules strict. Yet those who left often did so with something indescribably lighter in their souls. Among the visitors was Yuna, a woman in her late 30s, whose face carried the tired lines of a life spent trying to please everyone but herself. She had worked as a public relations manager for years, expertly shaping public images while ignoring the shattering fractures in her own inner landscape. After a burnout and a breakdown that ended in her collapsing during a press conference, Yuna left Tokyo behind. She came to the retreat not knowing what she was seeking, only that her heart ached and nothing she had ever done seemed to matter anymore. Upon arrival, she was assigned a single small room with a thin futon, a paper screen window, and no mirror. This last absence struck her most. No mirror, nowhere to see herself, to adjust her hair, to ensure her appearance, something that had always been part of her identity. Meals were silent. Mornings were filled with chores, sweeping, cutting vegetables, tending the garden. Afternoons were for meditation, evenings passed in chanting, days blurred. At first Yuna's mind screamed in protest. Why am I here? This is a waste. I need to fix my life, not sit and breathe. But eventually, the silence began to wear down her resistance, like waves smoothing a stone. Still, something gnawed at her. On the 7th day, Yuna was summoned by the abbot, a man so old he moved like breath. He simply said, "You will begin mirror practice tomorrow." She bowed, uncertain what it meant. The next morning, a novice led her through the woods to a small hut she had never seen before. Inside was a single object, an ancient bronze mirror resting on a wooden stand. Its surface was slightly mottled, but still reflective. The room had no other features. "Sit," the novice said, and then left. Yuna sat in front of the mirror. She looked at herself. No makeup, no professional attire, just a woman with hollow eyes and trembling hands. Her first instinct was revulsion. "This is what I've become," she whispered. But hours passed, and she remained. No one came. There was no guidance, no instruction. Just her and her reflection. She began to weep, first from shame, then from grief, then from something she couldn't name. Her face twisted and collapsed. She remembered every lie she had told to keep her job, every friendship she had neglected, every time she had said yes when she meant no. By the 2nd day, her tears had run dry. Now her gaze softened. She no longer looked for flaws in the mirror, no longer judged the dark circles or sagging cheeks. She just watched, like clouds drifting across the sky. Thoughts came and went. Memories surfaced, as did regrets. But something else also appeared, a sense of space behind those feelings. On the 3rd day, she began to speak aloud. "I've always been afraid of being seen. I wore masks for everyone. I thought if I looked perfect, I'd be loved." The mirror didn't respond, but something in its stillness offered a strange comfort, as if it had heard it all before. From 1,000 souls before hers, each day she returned. She sat in silence. She confessed. She remembered. And in time, she forgave. On the 7th day, the abbot visited her in the hut. He said nothing at first, only watched her from behind. Then he asked, "What do you see now?" Yuna looked into the mirror. "I see a woman, not perfect, not broken, just present." The abbot nodded. Double quotes, "Most people believe mirrors reflect the face, but in silence, they begin to reflect the soul. And when the soul stops grasping, even the mirror becomes empty." He bowed and left her alone. Yuna looked again. Her image was there, and yet something had shifted. It felt translucent, not unreal, but not fixed either, as if herself was not confined to this image. It was a movement, a breathing, a mystery. That night, she dreamt of standing in a river. The water was cold, but her body was warm. Across from her stood hundreds of other versions of herself, the child, the teenager, the overachiever, the exhausted adult, each holding hands with the next. She walked into them, and they all dissolved into a mist that rose into the sky. When she awoke, her chest felt light. For the first time in years, she did not reach for her phone or a plan. She simply breathed. Before she left the retreat, the abbot handed her a small, smooth stone. "It's not a mirror," he said, "but it can remind you that the reflection is never the thing itself." Yuna returned to Tokyo months later, but not to the same life. She began teaching mindfulness to overworked professionals. She no longer chased admiration. She dressed simply. She laughed more. Her friends said she had changed, but couldn't say how. In the quiet of her new apartment, by a window with no curtain, the small stone lay beside a simple bronze mirror, and some mornings she would sit, gaze at her reflection, and smile. She had learned that peace wasn't found by escaping the self, but by seeing through it, until only presence remained. Story 21. The empty teacup. It was a cold morning in late autumn. The wind slid between the rice fields, dry and without mercy, leaving brittle leaves scattered like forgotten memories. In the far corner of a humble village, nestled at the foot of a mountain, an old monk named Rusho sat outside his hermitage, holding a teacup that had no tea. Rusho was known throughout the region for his quiet wisdom. He rarely spoke, and when he did, people listened as though the mountain itself had whispered. He had been a Zen monk for over 60 years, and now, in his twilight years, his teachings had become fewer, but deeper. That morning, a young man from the capital arrived at his gate. The man bowed hastily. "Master Ryusho, I have come a long way," he said. "Please teach me the wisdom of Zen. I wish to understand truth. I've read books, heard many talks, and even practiced meditation, but I still feel ... hollow." Rusho looked at him, his gaze unreadable. "Come, sit." The young man followed him to a small wooden porch outside the hermitage. The old monk brought out a simple clay pot and 2 mismatched teacups. He poured tea into one cup, then into the other, which he handed to the visitor. The young man sipped the tea and began speaking rapidly. "I've studied under scholars and even practiced in temples. I can quote sutras and understand koans. But the more I learn, the more restless I become. There's always more knowledge, more teachings, more paths. I want to get to the heart of it. I want to master Zen." Ryusho smiled faintly and said nothing. He took the young man's cup and slowly began pouring more tea into it. The tea reached the rim and then began to overflow. "Master," the young man shouted, "you're spilling the tea." Ryusho stopped, still smiling. "Exactly," he said. The young man frowned. "I don't understand. You are like this cup," Ryusho replied, "full of knowledge, full of words, full of ideas and ambitions. There is no room for truth. How can I pour anything into a cup that is already full?" The young man's shoulders sagged. He lowered his gaze. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound being the wind brushing past the bamboo fence. "Then what must I do?" he asked finally. "Empty your cup," Rusho said. "Come back tomorrow." That night, the young man could not sleep. His mind raced. Empty my cup. What does that mean? Forget what I've learned. Abandon everything. He sat in meditation, but found no peace. He tried to write, but his words felt like ash. When dawn came, he walked again to the monk's hermitage. Rousseau was already waiting with tea. "You look tired," he said. "I couldn't sleep," the young man admitted. "I tried to empty my mind, but I don't know how." "Then let me show you," the monk said gently. He led the young man down a narrow path behind the hermitage. They walked in silence until they came to a small stream that trickled over smooth stones. Rousseau pointed to a flat rock and motioned for the young man to sit. "Watch the water," he said. "Do nothing else." The young man sat and stared at the stream. At first, his thoughts buzzed like bees in a jar. Questions, doubts, plans, regrets all swirled within him. But the water moved on, indifferent. Minutes passed, then an hour, and slowly his mind began to quiet. He noticed how the water flowed around obstacles, never fighting them. He noticed a leaf riding the current, graceful in surrender. He noticed the sound, soft, eternal murmur, like the whisper of time itself. When he finally turned, Rousseau was gone. That evening, he returned to the hermitage. Rousseau handed him a cup of tea again. This time, the young man waited before drinking. "I sat with the stream today," he said, "and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to solve anything. I just ... listened." Rousseau nodded. "That is the first sip of emptiness." In the days that followed, the young man stopped asking questions. He swept the yard without seeking meaning. He gathered firewood with quiet hands. He followed the wind with his eyes and let go of the need to name what he saw. Weeks passed. The leaves fell. Then snow began to kiss the earth. One morning, as he prepared tea for the monk, he paused and looked at the steam rising from the cup. "I think I understand now," he said softly. Rousseau looked up. "The cup doesn't need to be filled to have purpose. Its emptiness is what makes it useful." The monk's eyes gleamed. "You are ready for what? To return?" The young man looked confused. "Return where? To the world," Rousseau said. "Zen is not about escaping. It's about seeing clearly. The market, the street, your home, they are your monastery now." The young man lowered his head. "But I don't feel wise." "Good," Rousseau said. "If you did, I'd be worried." They both laughed as he departed the village. The young man carried nothing but a simple teacup Rousseau had given him. It was empty, but within him, something had shifted. The path ahead was no longer something to conquer, but something to walk with humility. He no longer sought to grasp truth like a possession, but to meet it, moment by moment, like the quiet stream meeting each stone and passing on. And so, his journey began not toward knowledge, but toward being. Story 22. The Tea House Under the Rain, Tretha. Old Tea House stood quietly beneath a sprawling rain tree at the edge of a forgotten village. Its wooden roof sagged, its paper lanterns faded, yet something in its silence whispered peace. Locals, rarely visited anymore. They preferred the faster, brighter cafes down in the town, with Wi-Fi and noise and frothy drinks that looked like fireworks. But the old tea house remained unchanged, unbothered, unwavering. Inside, Master Lin sat alone each morning, boiling water over charcoal, grinding tea leaves by hand, and listening. Not to customers, for there were few, but to the sounds of the world waking up, the soft tap of dew falling from leaves, the chirping of a distant sparrow, the slight hiss of the kettle coming to boil. His movements were slow, deliberate, and yet never sluggish. Every gesture was a form of meditation. Every cup of tea he brewed was a ceremony. No one knew much about him. Some said he used to be a monk. Others whispered he was a scholar who'd once taught the emperor's sons, but the truth, like the steam rising from his teapot, was impossible to catch. He never answered questions about the past. Instead, when asked, he would smile gently and pour another cup. One day, a woman arrived. She wore a black coat that had seen better days, her eyes sunken with the weight of sleepless nights. She did not speak as she entered. She simply bowed, sat, and stared at the wooden grain of the low table before her. Master Lin said nothing. He poured tea and set the cup before her. She didn't touch it. Minutes passed. Finally, she asked, "Do you believe a broken heart can kill?" Master Lin looked at her, not with surprise, but with the stillness of a mountain that has seen many storms. "Yes," he said. She looked up sharply. "Then what's the cure?" "Time," he said. She scoffed. "Time is not a cure. It's a delay." He poured himself a cup and took a slow sip. "Time is not a healer, but it is the space where healing may happen." She closed her eyes. "My husband left. No explanation, just gone. I begged him to stay. I changed myself. I shrank my world to his shadow. Then he vanished, and I couldn't find myself." Master Lin nodded, as if this was something he had heard 1,000 times, and yet it never lost its ache. "You gave your whole self away," he said, "and now you are searching for the pieces." She let out a shuddering breath. He pushed the teacup gently closer. "Drink. It is not medicine, but it may warm you." She picked it up. The scent of roasted oolong filled her nose. She took a small sip. It was neither bitter nor sweet, just earthy, steady, like something that had been waiting for her all along. They sat in silence. Outside, the wind rustled through the rain tree. A leaf drifted down, spiraling gently to the moss-covered stones. "I feel empty," she said. "You are," said Master Lin, "and that is not a curse. It is space. The cup must be empty before it can be filled." She stared at the tea. "But what if I never fill again?" "You will," he said, "but not with what you had before." Her voice was a whisper. "Then with what?" He looked into her eyes, soft but unwavering, with presence. "With your breath. With each quiet morning you survive. With the moment you notice the sun again, not because it rose, but because you did." A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it. "I come again?" she asked. "The door," he said, "is always open, for you, for sorrow, for healing." She returned the next day and the day after. Some days she talked. Other days she drank tea in silence. One morning she brought a sketchbook and began to draw the old rain tree. Another morning she helped sweep the leaves from the stones. Slowly, she smiled again, not often, but when it came, it was real. Like the first flower blooming after a long winter. She asked fewer questions, and Master Lin gave fewer answers, not because there was nothing left to say, but because now she had learned to listen. One day, a young man arrived, eyes filled with confusion. He had quit his job, left the city, lost all direction. He sat at a table, tense, arms folded. "I don't know who I am," he confessed. Master Lin poured tea. The woman, now a familiar presence, sat beside the window, watching the young man, frowned at the tea. "I need answers, not drinks." Master Lin smiled. "Then drink, and perhaps your questions will become clearer." Grudgingly, he did. He returned the next week. Then again, eventually, the woman and the young man spoke. Not often, but enough. The tea house slowly became a quiet refuge, not a busy place, not a business, but a space for grief, for uncertainty, for quiet rediscovery. Word spread. An elderly man came with a journal. He hadn't opened in 30 years. A girl came who couldn't stop crying. A boy with angry fists learned to breathe in silence. No, one was healed in a day, but healing, like tea, brewed slowly, and Master Lin remained, always listening, always pouring, not to fix, but to hold, not to answer, but to offer presence. One day the woman looked round the tea house, now filled with gentle voices, soft laughter, the clink of teacups. She turned to Master Lin and asked, "Why do you stay here, day after day, just serving tea?" He looked at the steam rising from the kettle and said, "Because in a world that rushes to fix, to talk, to do, someone must remember how to simply be." She nodded, understanding at last. That evening, as rain fell through the branches, Master Lin placed a small sign at the gate. It read, "The Tea House of Returning," and beneath it, "Come broken, leave whole. No rush, just tea." Story 23. The old bell maker of Hashen Vilajan village was nestled in a quiet valley, where the mist rose each morning from the river like a whispered prayer to the sky. It was a place of little renown, untouched by the ambition of the outside world, but among the villagers there lived an old man named Ryuma, known not for wealth or power, but for the bells he crafted, small ones for homes, large ones for temples, and some that sang so softly they could quiet the storms inside. Heart's Ryoma had lived alone for many years in a humble hut by the hill, surrounded by pine trees and memories. His bells were not just objects of sound. They were containers of silence, carved with the breath of wind and the patience of one who understood impermanence. Each bell carried a story, a silence between moments, a pause between regrets. One day, a young woman named Akari arrived from the city. She came with hurried footsteps and a face weighed down by loss. Her husband had died suddenly, a man who had been her childhood companion and the only person who had truly understood her. After his death, the city had grown louder, more cruel. She could not sleep. Every sound became a wound. Every silence became unbearable. She had heard, through a wandering monk, of Ryuma's bells, that some could calm the mind and others could ease sorrow. She found him crouched before a fire, polishing a half-finished bell. "You seek a bell," Ryuma said before she could speak, without looking up. "But not for decoration. You are seeking silence." Akari blinked, startled. "I am seeking peace." He looked up, his eyes like weathered stone. "Peace is not found. It is made like a bell, carefully, repeatedly, and it cracks when forced." She bowed low. "Will you teach me how to make one?" Ryuma studied her. "To make a true bell, you must first listen to the earth, to your breath, to your anger. Are you prepared to hear what you've tried to escape?" Akari hesitated, but something in her pain leaned forward and said yes, and so she stayed. The days became weeks. At dawn, Ryuma would take her to the river to gather clay. In the afternoon, they shaped molds. At night, they sat by the fire, not speaking much. At first, Akari tried to fill the silence with questions, but Ryuma rarely answered directly. "How do I know if it's good?" she asked once, holding up a clay mold she had spent 3 days on. "If you ask, it is not yet good." She grew frustrated, but in her frustration she noticed how her hands had changed, stronger, more deliberate. She learned to wait for the clay to dry naturally, not by the fire. She learned to feel the texture, not just see it. Her mind, once racing, began to slow. Even grief, that persistent shadow, started to breathe more gently beside her. One evening, as autumn colored the leaves gold, Akari asked Ryuma why he never left the village. "I once traveled," he said. "Long ago I saw wars. I saw temples turn to ash. I saw people who prayed to the gods with mouths full of hate. So I returned. I could not stop the world's fire, but I could make a sound that soothed it." "And has it worked?" she asked. Ryuma smiled faintly. "Sometimes." That winter, Akari finished her first bell. It was small and imperfect, with a tiny crack near the top. She was ashamed to show it. Ryuma took it gently and rang it. The sound was uneven, fragile, but there was something alive in it. "It's a beginning," he said, "but you must make another." So she did, and then another and another, each one more silent than the last. By spring, villagers began visiting again, asking for bells. Some wanted blessings for newborns, others protection for journeys. Akari listened to each request. She found that the bell she gave someone often told her more about them than their words had. One day, a wealthy merchant from the city arrived, with servants and gold. "I want a bell that makes me sleep," he said. "I'll pay you triple." Ryuma looked at him. "Sleep is not bought, but your bells cure grief." "No, they don't cure, they mirror." The merchant laughed. "Then make me one that lies." Ryuma shook his head, but Akari spoke. "You can't escape your own noise, but you can learn to sit beside it." The merchant left, confused and unsatisfied. That night, Ryuma handed Akari an old wooden box. Inside was a bell unlike any she had seen, thin as paper, with symbols etched in a forgotten script. "I made this when I was younger," he said, "when I believed the bell could carry the weight of the world, but it broke after one season. Not from sound, but from pride." Akari touched it gently. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because one day you will think you've mastered silence, and then you must begin again." Years passed. Ryuma grew slower. His hands trembled when he worked, but he smiled more often. Akari, now known as the bell maker of Hashin, had created dozens of bells, each tuned not to perfection, but to honesty. When Ryuma died, he left behind no fortune, no title, only a shelf of bells and a single note. "The sound you seek is the one between thoughts." At his funeral, Akari placed her first cracked bell beside his ashes. Then she rang it. The sound rose into the mountains, delicate and flawed, but filled with everything he had taught her, to listen not for silence, but within it. And somewhere in the distance, where the pine trees bent to the wind, it was said a small bird stopped its flight, closed its eyes, and rested in the space between the echoes. Story 24. The Sound of Silence. In a quiet village nestled between two mist-covered hills, there lived a man named Theon who had not spoken a word in over 20 years. He wasn't born mute, nor had he suffered an accident. His silence was a choice. Vow he took the day his younger brother died in a river he was supposed to be watching. Theon had been 17 at the time, and his brother, Seen, only 10. They had gone to the banks of the Mon River to collect firewood. The current that day was stronger than usual, but Theon had wandered off, chasing the scent of wild jasmine. When he returned, Seen was gone. Only a single sandal floated aimlessly along the shore. Since then, Theon had sealed his voice in grief and guilt. At first, villagers tried to help him recover, speaking to him, offering condolences, bringing food. But over the years, the concern turned into discomfort, and Theon became a shadow on the edges of the village, never a burden, never a problem, simply a man-shaped silence who walked among them. He lived alone in a small wooden hut beneath an ancient banyan tree and spent his days crafting intricate wooden flutes and prayer beads. Strangely, the flutes were never played. They remained on a simple shelf, collecting dust and sunlight. Children dared each other to approach him, whispering tales of a cursed man, a ghost in living form. But none were brave enough to step close. Only old monk Swan, who came down from the mountain temple every few weeks, visited Theon without fear. He brought rice, incense, and scrolls. The monk never forced words into the silence. He simply sat beside Theon and let the wind speak. One day, a little girl from the village went missing. Panic erupted like wildfire. Parents shouted, search parties formed, lanterns lit up the surrounding forest. Her name was Neela, and she was 5. She had last been seen following a stray cat toward the riverbank. Night fell fast. Theon was in his hut when he heard the commotion. He stepped outside, stood beneath the banyan, and listened not just with his ears, but with his soul. In the deep hush of the night, the wind shifted, carrying a faint sound that only someone who had lived in silence for decades could hear, a soft, uneven whimper. He moved like a shadow, barefoot across rocks and moss, navigating by memory and instinct. The villagers saw him vanish into the woods, but didn't follow, still uncertain whether he was protector or phantom. Hours passed. Then, just as dawn broke, Theon emerged from the trees with Neela in his arms, dirty, scratched, crying, but alive. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. He simply handed her over to her mother and walked back to his hut, where he washed his hands in the basin and stared out at the morning light. But something shifted after that day. People stopped whispering when he passed. Children no longer ran from him but began to wave. One morning, Monk Swan arrived and found a flute lying on the step outside Theon's hut. Simple piece of bamboo with tiny carvings of waves and a floating sandal. "Do you want me to play it?" the monk asked softly. Theon nodded, and so the old monk played. The notes that rose were not just sound. They were a story of grief, of memory, of a lost boy and a brother who never forgave himself, of years spent in silence as penance, of a moment of redemption when silence heard what noise had missed. The village gathered outside the hut, not speaking, not intruding, just listening. When the music ended, Theon turned toward them, his eyes deep pools of humility. He stepped forward. His lips parted. A breath, then a single word escaped, a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Forgive. It was not clear whether he was asking for it or offering it. Perhaps both. He wept not like a man broken, but like a man. Finally, freed from that day forward, Theon spoke sparingly, with care, as if each word were a jewel formed over long centuries. But he did speak. He taught the village children to make flutes. He helped rebuild the temple gate. He sat by the river and laughed quietly when the wind tousled his silver hair. Silence had not left him. It had simply changed shape. He no longer avoided the village bell, once a sound that echoed like punishment in his mind. Now, when it rang, he would pause in his step, close his eyes, and smile, because the sound of silence, he had learned, was not the absence of noise, it was the presence of deep, awakened listening, the space where transformation begins. and in that space, every broken thing could one day begin again. Story 25. The Last Leaf of the Bodhi Tree. The Bodhi tree in the center of Hanalaya Monastery had stood for over 600 years. Its roots reached like fingers into the stone courtyard, and its wide green leaves whispered secrets to anyone who sat long enough to listen. It was said that when the first Zen master planted it, he whispered a single truth into the soil. All things that fall, fall into awakening. The monks believed this was not metaphor. They believed the tree listened, learned, and taught in silence. Among the monks was an old man named Bhavan, who had been at the monastery since he was 12. Now he was nearing 80, with eyes like calm lakes and hands that trembled only when carving calligraphy. He was the quietest of them all, and the youngest monks often mistook him for a simple gardener. As he spent his mornings sweeping fallen leaves and his evenings brushing ink into silence, Bhavan had not taken a student in over 30 years. Some whispered it was because his last disciple had died young-burned in a village riot during his journey through the southern provinces. Others said Bhavan believed no one could truly grasp what he carried, but the truth was simpler. Bhavan was waiting. One autumn morning, a novice named Sora was assigned to assist Bhavan with garden chores. Sora was quick-tongued and restless, a boy of 17 with questions that fell like rain and never stayed to soak the soil. He had arrived only 6 months earlier, escaping city life, a fractured family, and an anxious mind. Sora did not understand silence. He feared it when he first worked with Bhavan. He asked questions non-stop. Why do we sweep the leaves every morning if they fall again by noon? Why are we told to sit in stillness when thoughts keep shouting? Why did the Buddha touch the ground under the Bodhi tree? Bhavan said nothing. He simply pointed to the broom and kept sweeping. Days passed, weeks. Sora grew more frustrated. He felt invisible in Bhavan's presence, as if the old man saw through him into a future he wasn't ready to meet. One morning, while sweeping, Sora muttered, "It's just a tree. Why do they all worship it like it can speak?" Bhavan finally looked up. He gestured for Sora to sit beneath the Bodhi tree. Then he sat beside him, cross-legged, and placed a single fallen leaf into the boy's palm. "This," Bhavan said, his voice soft but clear, "is the tongue of the tree." Sora blinked. "It's just a leaf." Bhavan smiled. "You say that because you haven't listened." He pointed at the leaf's veins. "This is how it remembers the wind. These tears on the edge are where it grieved a passing storm. And this line in the center, that is the spine of balance, the axis between reaching and letting go." Sora was quiet. Bhavan continued, "Every leaf is a sermon. Every fall is a teaching. But you cannot learn from what you do not honor." That night, Sora stayed beneath the tree long after the lamps were extinguished. For the first time, he let the silence wrap around him like a cloak rather than a cage. He began to listen, not with ears, but with breath. Autumn deepened. Leaves fell like golden rain. The monks swept them each morning, yet Sora began collecting, one each day, writing a single word on it: gratitude, grief, anger, silence, home. He strung them together by thread and kept them by his bed. On the final day of autumn, Bhavan collapsed near the temple bell. The monks carried him to his quarters. The doctor came. There was nothing to be done. Age had simply called him home, asked for one thing, that he be taken to the Bodhi tree for his final breaths. The monks prepared a mat under the tree, lit incense, and kept silent vigil. Sora sat by his side, clutching the thread of leaves. Bhavan opened his eyes once more. "Do you know," he whispered, "what the last leaf teaches?" Sora leaned in, tears already rising. Bhavan smiled, pointing upward. "The last leaf does not fear the fall, because it knows the ground is sacred." Then he closed his eyes, and his final breath was a whisper carried by the tree. Bhavan was buried beneath the Bodhi tree, as tradition allowed for elder masters. The monks held 7 days of prayer. Sora did not speak through all of them. When the final prayer ended, Sora gathered his string of leaves and hung them on the lowest branch of the tree. He then took up Bhavan's broom and began sweeping. The monks watched. They no longer saw a restless boy. They saw the beginning of a teacher. Years later, pilgrims came and asked for the story of the boy who became the voice of the tree. Sora would smile, hand them a broom or a leaf, and say, "The tree does not speak in words, it teaches in falling." And when one asked what happened to Bhavan's soul, Sora pointed upward. He rose with the wind, but he left his silence behind. If this story touched a quiet place within your heart, if, for a moment, it helped you slow down and truly listen, not just with your ears, but with your breath, then perhaps you've already heard the Bodhi tree speaking at the empty boat. We believe in the healing power of silence, stories, and wisdom carried across centuries. If you felt a shift, no matter how small, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What did this tale stir in you? What leaf would you hang on your own thread of life? Your reflections help us grow, and your presence here creates a space for stillness in a noisy world. If you found value in this story, please like the video, share it with someone who may need a moment of peace, and subscribe to The Empty Boat for more Zen-inspired tales and contemplative journeys. Until next time, may the last leaf remind you, the ground beneath you is sacred. Thank you for being here.